Imagine an island. Not a small island. Not a rocky outcrop battered by salt spray and indifferent to human presence. This is a large island, long and mountainous, stretched across the southern arc of the Aegean Sea like a sleeping body. Its spine is a range of peaks that catch clouds and hold snow well into spring. Its northern coast curves gently, offering sheltered bays and natural harbours where boats may rest. Its southern coast drops more sharply to the sea, the cliffs falling into deep water that is impossibly, unreasonably blue. It is the kind of blue that people who have never seen it do not quite believe exists. The island is Crete, and it is spring. Some spring more than 4,000 years ago, long before the world you know had taken shape. The air is warm and scented with thyme and wild sage and the salt of the sea. On the hillsides, the flowers are extraordinary. Red poppies, white asphodel, purple crocus, yellow broom, scattered across the rocky slopes in profusions that seem almost deliberate, almost designed, as though someone spent centuries perfecting a garden and then let it grow wild. Along the northern coast, at the edge of a gentle valley that opens toward the sea, something is being built. No, something has already been built. Something enormous, spreading, labyrinthine. A complex of rooms and corridors and courtyards, so vast that it seems to have grown rather than been constructed, as though the building breathed and expanded over the centuries of its existence. The walls are plastered and painted in vivid colours, red and blue and yellow and black, with images that are unlike anything else being made anywhere else in the world at this moment. A bull leaps. A young man soars over its back, hands on the horns, body arched against the sky. Dolphins swim through painted waves below a figure that seems to float weightlessly above the sea. A procession of women moves through a garden of saffron flowers, their elaborate robes trailing behind them, their gestures ceremonial and precise. Griffins with golden wings crouch beside a throne carved from alabaster so fine that light passes through it. This is Knossos, the heart of the Minoan world, the seat of a civilization that was flourishing, brilliantly, joyfully, almost impossibly, at a time when most of Europe was still scattered groups of farmers and herders who had barely heard of bronze. Tonight, we are going to tell their story. From the first farmers who crossed from Anatolia to Crete 9,000 years ago, carrying their seeds and their animals and their hope for a new beginning, to the cataclysm that may, or may not, have brought the Minoan world to its end. From the palaces that rose and fell and rose again along the northern coast, to the thalassocracy, the sea empire that spread Minoan culture across the islands of the Aegean like the ripples from a stone dropped in still water. From the strange, beautiful, endlessly fascinating art that covers their walls and fills their storerooms, to the writing systems they invented and that we cannot fully read. The Minoans are the great mystery civilization of Europe, the civilization that stood at the beginning, that was, in many senses, the opening chapter of the story of Western civilization, and that vanished so thoroughly that for over 3,000 years the world forgot they had ever existed, until one man, at the turn of the 20th century, picked up a spade on a Cretan hillside and found everything. Before we begin, I want to invite you to do something. Let your body settle. Let whatever you are carrying today, the weight of decisions, the residue of conversations, the long accumulation of small tensions, let it go, just for this moment. You have travelled, in the last hour and in the last year, a very long way. For the next few hours, you can rest. You can let someone else carry the story. That is what stories are for. Tell me where you are tonight. What does the air feel like where you are listening? Is it warm or cold? Is it raining? Can you hear the sea? Leave a comment below, because somewhere, in a dozen countries, on every continent, other people are listening to this same story, under skies of different colours, and it is a beautiful thing to be reminded that we are all doing this together. Now, breathe slowly. Let the Mediterranean light filter down through your eyelids. We are going back, far back, to the beginning of something that, once it had started, could not be stopped. The story of the Minoans does not begin with palaces. It does not begin with frescoes or bull leaping or the glittering objects of gold and ivory that fill the museum cases of Heraclion. It begins, as all stories begin if you trace them back far enough, with people arriving somewhere new. The island of Crete sits at the southern end of the Aegean world. It is approximately 250 kilometers long and somewhere between 12 and 60 kilometers wide, depending on where you measure. It rises steeply to peaks over 2,000 meters high in the central massif, the mountains the ancient Greeks would later call Ida and Dicte, and it falls away to gentler terrain along the northern coast. Before human beings arrived, it was a world of silence and wild things. The geological record tells us that Crete was separated from the Greek mainland early in prehistoric time, before the ancestors of European deer and horses and cattle reached the island. As a result, when humans first encountered it, Crete's native fauna was strange: miniature hippos and miniature elephants, creatures that had evolved in isolation over millions of years and had become, through the peculiar alchemy of island evolution, both familiar and deeply strange. These animals would not survive the arrival of humans. Within a relatively short span of time, after the first colonizers came, the miniature megafauna of Crete had vanished. An island that had maintained its isolation for millions of years was suddenly, irreversibly transformed. The first human colonizers of Crete arrived, most archaeologists now believe, from Anatolia, the region we now call Turkey, somewhere around 7000 BC, give or take a millennium. They came by boat, which is itself a remarkable thing. The crossing from Anatolia to Crete is not trivial. It requires navigating the open Aegean, reading the winds and the currents, trusting a craft made of wood and reed and animal hide to carry you and your family and your animals across 100 kilometers of open water. They carried with them the entire package of Neolithic life: domesticated cattle, sheep and goats, seeds of wheat and barley and lentils, the knowledge of pottery making and weaving, the social structures of settled agricultural communities, the hierarchies, the kinship networks, the religious practices, the accumulated technical knowledge of people who had been farming the eastern Mediterranean for generations before they made this crossing. We do not know why they came. Perhaps the population pressure in Anatolia was pushing people outward, toward the islands they could see on the horizon on clear days. Perhaps there was violence at home, a raid, a dispute, a catastrophic failure of crops, that sent a group of families to sea with everything they could carry. Perhaps someone simply looked at the dark shape of Crete on the horizon, visible on a clear day from the heights of southwestern Anatolia, and felt the pull of the unknown. Whatever brought them, they came. They settled. They planted their crops in the rich Cretan soil. They grazed their animals on the island's hillsides. They built their houses of mud, brick and stone. And over the following centuries and millennia, they multiplied. The Neolithic period in Crete, roughly 7000 to 3000 BC, is long. It is 4,000 years long. 4,000 years of farming and herding and pottery making and slow, incremental accumulation of the knowledge and the population density and the social complexity that would eventually, at a pace that makes human impatience seem absurd, produce the Minoan civilization. The earliest well-documented Neolithic site in Crete is Knossos itself, the very site that would become the greatest of all Minoan palaces. The mound at Knossos contains layer after layer of prehistoric occupation, reaching down, like a geological core sample, through 7,000 years of human presence. At the bottom, beneath all the brilliant palatial architecture, beneath the painted walls and the storage magazines and the throne room, there are the remains of simple mud brick houses, the ash of hearth fires, the bones of animals eaten by people who did not yet have bronze, who had not yet imagined the kind of world their descendants would build on the same ground. It is one of the most extraordinary facts in European archaeology. The site of Knossos has been continuously occupied, in one form or another, for 9,000 years. The ground beneath the palace knows everything. It has been watching since the beginning, through the Neolithic and into the early Bronze Age. Roughly 3000 to 2000 BC, the population of Crete grew, diversified, and began to show the first signs of the social complexity that would produce the Minoan palatial system. Trade with the Aegean Islands and with Egypt and the Levant brought new materials, new ideas, new technologies. The technique of working bronze, alloying copper with tin to produce a metal harder and more useful than either component alone, arrived in Crete from the eastern Mediterranean world and transformed the possibilities of tool-making, weapon-making, and eventually art. The early Bronze Age Cretans were not yet Minoans, not in the full sense of the word, but they were becoming something new, something that had no exact parallel anywhere else. The island itself was shaping them. The sea surrounded them, limited them, and also opened them to the world. The mountains created distinct regions and distinct communities, each with their own character. The fertile valleys and coastal plains provided enough food for a growing population. The forests of the highlands provided timber for boats. The copper deposits of the island's eastern regions provided raw material for metalwork. Everything that would be needed was present. The question was, what would be made of it? Around 2000 BC, give or take a century on either side, which is the best precision ancient dates usually allow, something changed in Crete. The change was not sudden. It never is, not really, not in archaeology. What we call a transition, a revolution, a transformation is almost always, when examined closely, a slow crystallization, the moment when 1,000 separate developments reach a threshold and suddenly, from the outside, seem to produce something entirely new. What emerged in Crete around 2000 BC was the palace. Not the palace in the sense of a monarch's private residence, a building designed primarily for the comfort and display of a single powerful individual. The Minoan palace was something different, something more complex, something that seems to have served functions we associate not with private residences, but with cities, with temples, with economic institutions, and with centers of political power all at once. The great Minoan palaces, Knossos on the north coast, Phaistos and Hagia Triada in the south, Malia to the east of Knossos, Zakros at the far eastern tip of the island, and Galatas in the center, were not merely large houses. They were the organizing centers of entire regional economies. They were the places where agricultural surplus was collected, stored, and redistributed, where craftsmen produced luxury goods, where ritual life was performed and overseen, where records were kept, where the threads of an entire society were gathered and held. The Minoan palace was, in a very real sense, a machine for running a civilization. The physical structure of a Minoan palace is immediately distinctive. At its heart is the central court, a large, rectangular, open space oriented roughly north-south. The central court is not an accident, it is a constant feature, found in every Minoan palace, regardless of the palace's overall size or the period of its construction. It was, clearly, fundamental to the way the palace functioned. Around the central court, the palace rooms were arranged in a complex that could expand outward in multiple directions, west and east and north and south, as the needs of the palace grew. Storerooms, with their massive clay storage jars, the famous pithoi, some of them taller than a standing human and capable of holding hundreds of liters of olive oil or grain or wine, were typically arranged along the west side of the court. Residential and ceremonial areas were on the east. Workshops and service areas occupied the fringes. The result was a structure of extraordinary complexity. Knossos, at its greatest extent, covered an area of roughly 20,000 square meters. It had hundreds of rooms arranged on at least 2 stories, perhaps more in places. It had drainage systems, light wells, and staircases that descended into cool subterranean storage areas. It was not built all at once. Like an organism, it grew. It was modified, expanded, damaged, rebuilt. The excavators who dug at Knossos in the early 20th century found layer after layer of construction, each representing a phase of the palace's long life. The palace that stands today, partially reconstructed, controversially reconstructed, as we will discuss, is only the latest version of a building that was continuously modified for over 1,000 years. The first palaces, the ones that archaeologists call protopalatial, dating roughly from 2000 to 1700 BC, were themselves already sophisticated. They show evidence of the central court, of the storeroom arrangement, of the basic organizational logic that would characterize the Minoan palace tradition for the next 500 years. What made them Minoan? What made them distinctly, recognizably part of a specific cultural tradition rather than simply large buildings, was the art. Even in the protopalatial period, the Minoan decorative tradition was developing its characteristic features: pottery painted with flowing, natural designs, spirals, marine life, plant forms, seal stones carved with images of animals and supernatural beings, pressed into clay to mark administrative documents, the beginnings of the fresco tradition that would reach its full flowering in the later palaces. The Cimmerian ware, a type of pottery produced during the protopalatial period and named for the cave sanctuary where examples of it were first discovered, is among the most beautiful pottery produced anywhere in the ancient world. Made on a fast wheel, fired at high temperatures, decorated with vivid cream and red designs on a dark background, it shows a technical mastery and an aesthetic confidence that speaks of a tradition already fully formed, already certain of itself and its direction. But around 1700 BC, the first palaces were destroyed. The cause is uncertain. Earthquake is the most common explanation. Crete sits in one of the most seismically active regions of the Mediterranean, and earthquakes capable of devastating large stone structures would have been recurring features of Cretan experience. The evidence at some sites does suggest sudden, catastrophic collapse of the kind that earthquakes produce, but whether it was earthquake alone, or earthquake combined with fire, or fire alone, or something else entirely, internal conflict, external invasion, some combination of causes that the archaeological record cannot clearly separate, the destruction was real. The first palaces fell, and then, almost immediately, they were rebuilt. The Neopalatial period, roughly 1700 to 1400 BC, is the golden age of Minoan civilization. It is the age in which everything that we associate with the Minoans reached its fullest expression. The frescoes, the spectacular palatial architecture, the sea trade that carried Minoan goods and Minoan influence across the entire Aegean world, the administrative system, the religious life, the extraordinary, joyful, mysterious culture that would captivate the imagination of the modern world when it was rediscovered at the very beginning of the 20th century. To understand the Minoans fully, to feel the weight of what they were and what they created, we need to spend time in the world they made. We need to walk through the palaces, to look at the art, to understand the economy and the religion and the society. We need to sit with the mystery of what we do not know and cannot know. But first, we need to meet the man who found them. In the autumn of 1894, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans arrived on the island of Crete. He was 43 years old, small in stature. He stood just over 5 feet tall and severely nearsighted. He carried a short walking stick that he used not for support, but as a kind of extension of his personality, pointing at things, gesturing with it, poking it into the earth with the impatient energy of a man who was always convinced that what he was looking for was just beneath the surface. He had come to Crete for reasons that were, at first, only loosely connected to the site that would consume the rest of his life. He was interested in early forms of writing, specifically in the mysterious seal stones that had been appearing on the Cretan antiquities market for years, carved with symbols that bore no resemblance to any known script. The local Cretan women called them galapetras, milk stones, and wore them as amulets to help nursing mothers produce milk. Evans recognized them as something more significant. He was right. But the full scale of what he had stumbled toward would not become clear for another 5 years. In March of 1900, Evans began excavating at a mound called Kephala on the outskirts of the modern town of Heraklion. He had purchased a share of the site years earlier, and with Crete's recent liberation from Ottoman rule having simplified the legal situation, he was at last free to dig. The excavation moved fast. Evans had resources, his own family wealth, supplemented by the research budget of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, of which he was keeper, and he applied them energetically. Within the first week, his workers had uncovered sections of massive walls. Within the first month, the outlines of the palace were becoming visible. Within the first year, it was clear that this was the largest and most important Bronze Age site ever excavated in the Aegean. Room after room opened before the excavators, storage magazines filled with enormous pithoi, still bearing the marks of the seal impressions that had identified their contents. A room Evans called the throne room, containing a gypsum throne flanked by painted griffins, still in situ after 3,500 years, the oldest throne in Europe, possibly the oldest throne in the world. Corridors that branched and turned and doubled back on themselves in ways that seemed designed to confuse anyone unfamiliar with the building's logic. The frescoes were the most astonishing discovery. Fragments of painted plaster, some in brilliant condition, preserving colours of extraordinary vividness, were found throughout the palace. They showed processions of figures in elaborate dress, youths with dark, curling hair, young women with elaborate hairstyles and open-fronted robes, the famous bull leapers, dolphins and flying fish painted in a space Evans interpreted as a queen's bathroom, blue monkeys clambering through thickets of papyrus in a garden that existed only in paint but felt entirely real. Evans was not merely an archaeologist. He was a man of Victorian confidence and vast personal resources, and he decided almost immediately that he would not merely excavate Knossos, he would restore it. He would rebuild the destroyed upper stories in reinforced concrete, repaint the damaged frescoes, make the palace comprehensible to modern visitors in a way that a field of ruin and fragments could not be. This decision has been controversial ever since. The reconstruction at Knossos is, by the standards of modern archaeology, deeply problematic. Evans made decisions about what the upper floors looked like, how the frescoes originally appeared, how the whole building functioned. decisions based on limited evidence, informed by his own theories and his own aesthetic sensibilities, presented to the world with a confidence that went well beyond what the evidence supported. Some of his interpretations were certainly wrong. Some of the reconstructed frescoes are now known to have been assembled incorrectly, fragments from different paintings combined into single images that never originally existed. Some of the architectural reconstructions reflect Evans's vision of a specifically Minoan aesthetic, rather than a careful reconstruction of what was actually there. And yet, Knossos as Evans left it. The reconstructed palace with its red-painted columns, its dramatic spaces, its vivid frescoes, is, in some fundamental sense, what most people imagine when they think of Minoan civilization. It is the image that has shaped the world's understanding of this culture for over a century. It is, for all its problems, the lens through which the Minoans first became legible to the modern world. Evans named the civilization he had discovered after the mythological king of Crete, Minos, son of Zeus and Europa, lord of the labyrinth, master of the Minotaur. The name Minoan was his invention. The people who built these palaces did not call themselves Minoans. We do not know what they called themselves, because their writing has not been fully deciphered, but the name stuck. And in a sense it was appropriate. Not because the legends of Minos have any necessary historical connection to the Minoan civilization, but because those legends were, perhaps, the garbled, distorted memory of something real. The memory of a great civilization on an island, controlling the sea, commanding tribute, possessing a labyrinthine palace, and a power that the Greek world had not forgotten even after 3,000 years. The myth, as it turned out, was a shadow cast by history. Let us walk through Knossos. Not the Knossos of Evans's reconstruction, with its concrete columns and its reproduced frescoes. The real Knossos, the Knossos of 1700 to 1400 BC, at the height of the Neopalatial period, when the palace was alive and functioning and full of people whose names we do not know, but whose world we can partially reconstruct. We approach from the west, along a paved road that led down from the hill above. Even the road is impressive, wide, carefully laid, evidence of an infrastructure consciousness that distinguishes the Minoan world from most of its contemporaries. The road passes through a gatehouse and widens into a paved court. Ahead of us, the western facade of the palace rises. It is not what we might expect from a building of this importance. There is no monumental gateway, no columns flanking an imposing doorway, no inscription announcing the glory of the ruler within. The western facade is, if anything, understated. A long, slightly irregular wall of carefully fitted stone, broken by a series of orthostats at the base, and interrupted at intervals by the slight projections of pillar cribs, the structural reinforcements that give Minoan architecture its distinctive rhythm. But there are frescoes visible through the openings, colours that do not exist in the natural landscape, a brilliant lapis blue, a warm terracotta red, a crisp chalky white. They hint at the world within. We enter through the west porch, past a fresco of a bull, enormous, dynamic, its great body filled with a coiled energy that suggests it might at any moment leap from the painted wall and crash into the actual space of the room. This is a threshold painting, a warning and a welcome. You are entering a space where the bull is present, where the energy of the bull, its power, its fertility, its connection to forces that go deeper than human understanding, suffuses every room. Past the west porch, a corridor leads south, then turns east, descending slightly. This is the corridor of the procession, named for the fresco that once decorated its walls, a long, solemn procession of life-size figures carrying gifts, vessels of precious materials, bundles of perhaps grain or cloth, offerings whose nature is suggested but not entirely clear. The figures are rendered with a strange combination of formality and vitality. Their poses are conventional, their faces in profile, their bodies arranged in the flattened, hieratic way common to ancient Near Eastern art. But something in the painting is alive in a way that Egyptian or Mesopotamian art, for all its grandeur, rarely achieves. The Minoans had a sense of movement that is almost modern. Their figures seem to be actually walking, actually carrying, actually engaged with the world around them, rather than posing for eternity. We emerge into the central court. It is large, about 50 meters long and 25 meters wide. The proportions are not accidental. The court feels open, generous, breathing. The sky is above you. The air smells of thyme carried on the breeze from the hills, mixed with the complex fragrance of a large settlement, cooking, livestock, oil lamps, the mineral tang of stone. Around you, the palace rises on three sides. The fourth side opens to the east, and the gentle slope that leads down to the Kairiotos River Valley. Above the ground floor level, there are upper stories. The palace is not a sprawling single-story building, but a multi-level complex, its upper floors accessing more light and air than the ground floor rooms below. In the central court, on certain occasions, during the great festivals, the religious ceremonies, the moments of communal gathering that gave the palace its social meaning, there was bull leaping. The bull leapers, the youths and young women depicted so vividly in the frescoes, performed here. In this space, the great bulls that were central to Minoan religious life were brought out. The acrobats faced them. The performance began. We will return to the bulls and to what they meant in more detail shortly. From the central court, we go east, descending the grand staircase, one of the great architectural achievements of the Bronze Age, a 4-story staircase cut into the hillside with extraordinary sophistication. The staircase is not merely functional, it is beautiful. It descends through a series of open light wells, each bringing air and daylight deep into the palace's lower levels. The columns that line the staircase, tapered at the base, wider at the top, painted red, create a rhythm of form and colour that is satisfying in a way that is almost musical. At the base of the staircase, we enter the domestic quarter, the area that Evans interpreted as the private residential area of the palace's elite inhabitants. The Hall of the Double Axes is named for the symbol carved into its walls. The labrys, the double-headed axe that is one of the most distinctive and most ubiquitous symbols in Minoan culture. It appears on everything, on palace walls, on vessels of gold and silver, on bronze ingots, on seal stones, carved into the stone of the palace itself, as here, hundreds of times, covering entire surfaces. What did it mean? This is one of the questions that Minoan archaeology cannot answer with certainty. The labrys was clearly a sacred symbol. Its prevalence and its contexts leave no doubt of that. It appears in religious settings, on altars and offering tables, held by figures that seem to be performing ritual actions. The word labyrinth, the word for the palace itself, the word that echoed down through Greek mythology as the name of the building that contained the Minotaur, may derive from labrys, the house of the double axe. But what the axe symbolized, what concept or deity or cosmological principle it was meant to represent, remains uncertain. Some scholars believe it was a symbol of the divine feminine, associated with the goddesses who seem to have been central to Minoan religious life. Some believe it was a tool of sacrifice, associated with the ritual killing of the bulls that played such a central role in Minoan ritual. Some believe it was a symbol of political authority, marking the ownership of the palace and everything in it. It may have been all of these things at once. The Minoans, like most ancient peoples, probably did not maintain the sharp distinctions between religion, politics and economics that modern thought tends to impose on the past. Adjacent to the Hall of the Double Axes is a smaller room that Evans called the Queen's Megaron. Its most famous feature is the dolphin fresco, a wall painting of extraordinary freshness and vitality, showing dolphins swimming through blue water above a frieze of running spirals. The painting covers the upper portion of the wall and the beam above the doorway, creating the impression, in a room without windows, of being surrounded by the sea. Whether this room was actually a queen's private chamber, or something else entirely, a lustral basin area, a ceremonial space, a room for some function we have not correctly identified, is debated. But the dolphin fresco is among the most beautiful things ever made in the ancient world. Looking at it, across 35 centuries, the sea still moves. If the Celts are remembered for their art, their spirals and interlace and flowing natural forms, the Minoans are remembered for theirs, with an even more immediate, more visceral recognition. Because Minoan art is, in a way that Celtic art is not, immediately accessible to the modern eye. It is joyful. It is sensuous. It is full of the pleasure of being alive in a beautiful world. This is unusual in the art of the ancient world. Most ancient art is serious. It is monumental, funerary, propagandistic, religious. It celebrates power and memorializes death. It is addressed to gods and kings and to the judgments of eternity. It holds the human body at a formal distance, constraining it within conventions designed to express permanence and dignity rather than life. Minoan art is different. It is not that Minoan art is without religious significance. It clearly has deep religious dimensions, as we will see. But there is something in it that suggests a culture that took genuine, unashamed pleasure in the physical world, in the beauty of animals and plants, in the grace of the human body in motion, in the play of light on water, in the color and variety and movement of the natural world that surrounded the island. Let us look more closely at the frescoes. The technique was true fresco, pigment applied to wet plaster, so that as the plaster dried, the paint became part of the wall itself, rather than merely resting on its surface. This technique required speed and confidence, because the plaster dried quickly and could not be reworked. The Minoan fresco painters worked fast, and they worked well. The colors are remarkable. Minoan painters used a range of colors that was wide by ancient standards: white from gypsum or lime, black from carbon, red and yellow from iron oxides, blue from lapis lazuli or Egyptian blue, green from malachite or a mixture of other pigments. The blues and greens in particular achieve a vividness that seems almost impossible after 3,500 years. The subjects of the frescoes are a kind of inventory of the Minoan world, as the Minoans wished to see it. Nature is everywhere. Not nature as backdrop, not nature as setting for human drama, but nature as subject in its own right. The famous crocus gatherer's fresco from Crete on the island of Thera, technically a Cycladic site, but saturated with Minoan cultural influence, shows a young girl gathering saffron crocus blossoms with a concentration that suggests this is not merely labor, but something more. Around her, the landscape is vividly alive, rocks spotted with red and yellow, birds in flight, the whole scene charged with a sense of seasonal abundance. The spring fresco from the same site covers an entire wall with a landscape of lilies and swallows, the plants blooming in theatrical profusion, the birds darting and swooping in a sky of warm ochre. It is one of the most fully realized landscape paintings to survive from the ancient world. It does not merely show a landscape, it places you inside one. Marine imagery pervades Minoan art with an intensity that reflects the island people's deep relationship with the sea. Flying fish leap over painted waves. Octopuses spread their tentacles across the surfaces of ceramic vessels, their curling arms becoming almost abstract, almost ornamental, almost one of those spiraling forms that run through Minoan visual culture, like a recurring musical motif. Sea urchins, dolphins, nautilus shells, the entire inventory of Aegean marine life appears and reappears on pottery, on frescoes, on carved stone vessels, on gold jewelry. The octopus in particular became one of the defining symbols of Minoan ceramic art. In the marine-style pottery of the Neopalatial period, the octopus takes over the entire surface of the vessel, spreading from a central body across every curve and indent of the pot. As though the creature has embraced the vessel from within, the tentacles become spirals. The spirals become decoration. But the origin in the real animal, the real sea creature, is never entirely lost. This movement between the natural and the abstract, between accurate observation of the natural world and the transformation of those observations into pattern and design, is characteristic of Minoan art at its best. It is an art that loves the real world and cannot help turning it into beauty. The human figure in Minoan art has its own distinctive character, immediately recognizable once you know it. Minoan women, and women are spectacularly present in Minoan visual culture in a way that is startling compared to most ancient civilizations, are shown with elaborate hairstyles, long curling locks that fall across their shoulders and backs. They wear open-fronted bodices that expose the breasts, combined with flounced skirts of remarkable complexity, the fabric decorated with patterns that suggest weaving traditions of great sophistication. Their bodies are active, engaged, present. They move through the space of the painting with a confidence that suggests social agency as well as artistic convention. The male figures, shown darker skinned than the women, by an ancient convention that is found in Egyptian art as well, are slender and athletic, with narrow waists and broad shoulders, moving through athletic or ritual activities with a grace that the painters clearly found endlessly interesting. Both men and women in Minoan art wear jewelry, elaborate necklaces, bracelets, earrings. Both wear their hair long and carefully arranged. The elaborateness of personal appearance in Minoan art suggests a culture that placed a high value on physical presentation, that saw the adorned body as a kind of statement, a kind of artwork in itself. The bull-leaping fresco is, perhaps, the single most famous image of Minoan civilization. Let us look at it carefully. The fresco, found at Knossos, now reconstructed in the Heraclean Archaeological Museum, shows three figures engaged with a great bull. On the left, a figure grasps the bull's horns. In the center, a figure is shown in mid-leap over the bull's back, body arched, arms extended, hair flying. On the right, a figure stands with arms extended, apparently catching or preparing to catch the vaulter. The colouring follows the Minoan convention. The two flanking figures are rendered in the pale, cool tones associated with female figures. The central leaping figure is shown in the darker tones associated with males. This has been interpreted in various ways. Perhaps the teams of bull leapers included both men and women. Perhaps the pale and dark colouring represents different categories of participant rather than a simple gender distinction. The evidence does not allow certainty. What is certain is the image's power. The bull is enormous. Its body fills the entire horizontal space of the painting. Its great head lowered, its legs in full extension. It is a creature of overwhelming physical force, and yet the human figure arcing over its back transforms that force into something almost balletic, something that combines danger with grace in a way that is deeply viscerally appealing. Did this actually happen? Was bull leaping a real practice or an idealized, mythologized image? The evidence suggests it was real. The sheer number of times it is depicted, not just in the great Knossos fresco, but on seal stones, on carved ivory figurines, on gold rings, implies that this was not a purely imaginary activity, but something that actually occurred and that occupied a significant place in Minoan ritual life. How it was physically executed is a matter of genuine debate among athletes and biomechanics scholars. The maneuver as depicted, gripping the horns, using the bull's upward head movement to vault over its back, is, according to those who have studied it carefully, extremely dangerous but not physically impossible. It requires extraordinary athletic training, precise timing, and a relationship with the animal that implies long practice. Whether the performers survived is another question entirely. The image is glorious. The reality was probably brutal and frequently fatal. This combination, the glory and the danger, the beauty and the blood, is at the heart of the bull-leaping tradition and at the heart of what the bull meant to the Minoans. The beauty of Minoan art can blind us to something equally important, the extraordinary organizational sophistication that sustained it. The Minoan palace economy was one of the most complex administrative systems in the ancient world. The palaces were not merely ceremonial centers or royal residences. They were the engines of an integrated economic system that collected, stored, processed, and redistributed the agricultural and craft production of their entire regions. Understanding how this worked requires understanding the landscape. Crete is not uniformly fertile. The island's terrain is varied. There are rich valley floors and coastal plains where grain grew well. There are hillsides better suited to olive cultivation. There are higher pastures where goats and sheep could graze. Different parts of the island produced different things in different quantities. The palace system was, among other things, a mechanism for managing this diversity. Grain from the fertile plains around Knossos was stored in the palace's magazines and could be redistributed in times of shortage. Olive oil from the groves that terraced the hillsides was collected and stored in the giant pithoi, some of them holding over 1,000 litres, that line the great storage corridors. Wool from the flocks of the upland pastures was brought to the palace workshops, where it was woven into textiles by palace-employed workers. The scale of the storage capacity at Knossos is staggering. The Western magazines alone, if the pithoi had been filled to capacity, could have held something in the range of 75,000 litres of liquid, olive oil, wine, or water. This is not a private household's larder. This is a supply depot for a large population, an economic institution managing resources on a regional scale. How was this managed? How did the palace administration know what had come in, what had gone out, what was owed, what had been distributed? With writing, the Minoans developed two different writing systems, both of which are known to modern scholars, and neither of which is fully understood. The earlier system, Cretan hieroglyphic, appears in the Protopalatial period, and seems to have been used primarily for administrative purposes, for seal inscriptions and tablets recording economic transactions. It is largely undeciphered, its symbol inventory not yet mapped onto any known language. The later system, Linear A, replaced Cretan hieroglyphic around 1800 BC and remained in use throughout the Neopalatial period. Linear A is also undeciphered. Its underlying language is not known, and the absence of a bilingual inscription has made decipherment so far impossible. What we can read in Linear A, because the later Mycenaean Greeks adapted the script to write their own language, producing Linear B, which was deciphered by Michael Ventris in 1952, are the numerical and logographic elements. We can see that Linear A tablets were used to record quantities of agricultural commodities and craft goods. We can see lists of what appears to be grain, olive oil, wool, figs, livestock. We can see something that looks like personal names and something that looks like place names. We can see, in other words, the skeleton of an economic administrative system. We can see that the palace was keeping records of inflows and outflows of goods. We can see that it was tracking what people owed and what had been distributed. We can see the bureaucratic infrastructure of a managed economy, but we cannot read the language in which all of this was expressed. We cannot hear the voices of the people who made these records. The Minoans are silent to us in a way that, for example, the ancient Egyptians and the Mesopotamians are not, because their language, whatever it was, died with their civilization and took no cognate forms with it into the future. This is one of the deepest mysteries of the Minoan world, not merely what happened to them, but who they were in their own language, in their own words, what they called their gods, what they called their kings or rulers, what prayers they offered, what stories they told, what they said to each other in the morning. We do not know, and we may never know. The craft production of the Minoan world was as impressive as its agricultural organization. Minoan craftsmen working in the palace workshops produced objects of staggering technical sophistication and beauty. The goldsmiths made jewelry of extraordinary delicacy. Thin sheets of gold, hammered into the shapes of animals and flowers, tiny figures assembled from multiple components, earrings and pendants and diadems that combined technical mastery with an aesthetic sensibility that was entirely, unmistakably Minoan. The Aegean treasure, a collection of gold objects found on the island of Aegean but now believed to have been made in Crete, includes a pendant showing a master of animals figure, flanked by geese, suspended below a cage of granulated gold, the whole piece assembled from dozens of separate elements, with a precision that would challenge a modern goldsmith. The carved stone vessels, rhytons, were used in religious rituals. Made from steatite, porphyry, serpentine, and other decorative stones, they were carved into the shapes of animals' heads, bulls' heads with gilded horns and eyes inlaid with rock crystal and painted ivory, or into conical forms decorated with relief scenes of athletic games and religious ceremonies. The harvester vase from Hagia Triada, a fragment of a black steatite rhyton showing a procession of harvesters in extraordinary low relief, is one of the most vivid depictions of ordinary life in the ancient world. The seal stones, the little carved gems whose images served as personal identifiers in the administrative system, were produced in enormous quantities, and many of them are works of miniature art of the highest order, carved from hard stones, carnelian, agate, amethyst, lapis lazuli. Using tools of equally hard stone and bronze, they show animals in motion, mythological creatures, religious scenes, human figures engaged in ritual activities, all rendered in spaces sometimes no larger than a thumbnail, with a precision and vitality that astonishes. The textile production of the Minoan world, though textiles themselves rarely survive the passage of millennia, is attested in the tablets and in the depictions of elaborate clothing in frescoes and figurines. The flounced skirts and decorated bodices visible in the paintings were not simple garments. They were complex constructions requiring skilled weavers, multiple dyeing processes, and the kind of patient, skilled labor that only a sophisticated textile industry could provide. The perfume industry, and here we can be specific because the palaces of Crete clearly organized the production and storage of scented oils, was another significant element of the Minoan economy. Olive oil mixed with fragrant plants, coriander, rose, sage, juniper, and perhaps imported materials from the eastern Mediterranean, was produced in palace workshops and distributed or traded. The scented oils had both practical and ritual uses. They anointed bodies, flavored food and drink, filled lamps, and were offered to the gods. The palace economy was, in short, a vast and complex operation that managed everything from the planting of grain to the production of luxury goods to the organization of long-distance trade. It was run by scribes and administrators, bureaucrats in the most literal sense, who kept records on clay tablets, who issued instructions through seal impressions, who managed an economy that touched every aspect of Minoan life. The Minoans were, above all, a maritime people. This is not a romantic characterization but a practical reality. Crete is an island. The sea surrounds it on all sides. The sea was the highway along which goods traveled, the barrier that protected the island from easy invasion, the medium through which contact with the wider world was maintained. The Minoans did not merely live beside the sea, they lived by it, through it, and for it. The ancient historian Thucydides, writing in the 5th century BC, described Minos, the legendary king of Crete, as the first ruler to establish a thalassocracy, a naval empire, a dominion of the sea. The historicity of this claim is uncertain. Thucydides was writing about legendary material, but it reflects a genuine ancient tradition that the Cretans of the Bronze Age had been the masters of the Aegean. The archaeological evidence supports this tradition. Minoan material culture pottery, stone vessels, seal stones, frescoes, architectural elements has been found not just in Crete but across the Aegean world. On the islands of Thera, Melos, Kea, Cythera and Rhodes, on the Greek mainland at Mycenae and Tiryns, in Egypt, where Minoan-style frescoes have been found in the palace complex at Tel el-Daba, apparently produced by Minoan artists working for the Egyptian court, along the coasts of the Levant. In Cyprus, this distribution of Minoan material is not the result of random drift or casual contact. It reflects a deliberate, organized engagement with the wider Mediterranean world, a trading network of considerable sophistication that brought Minoan goods to the markets of Egypt and the Levant, and brought back tin and copper and gold and ivory and the purple dye produced from murex shells and all the other materials that the Minoan luxury economy required. The Minoan ships that carried all of this, the vessels that made the thalassocracy real, are known to us from their depictions in frescoes and on seal stones. They were sophisticated by the standards of their time, relatively long, with a keel that gave them directional stability, capable of being propelled by oars or by sail depending on conditions. They could carry substantial cargoes across open water. The miniature fresco from Akrotiri on Thera shows a flotilla of such ships, a procession of long, narrow vessels moving through a harbour between two towns, their prows decorated with what appear to be dolphin figureheads, their sterns curving up into elaborate decorative forms. The fresco is unique, there is nothing else like it in Bronze Age art, and it gives us a glimpse of the Minoan maritime world in action, organized, purposeful, connected. The trade routes the Minoans maintained were long. From Crete, ships could sail east to Cyprus, the great copper island, the source of the metal that Bronze Age civilization was named for. From Cyprus, the route continued to the ports of the Levantine coast, Byblos, Ugarit, the cities of what is now Lebanon and Syria, where the products of Mesopotamia and inland Anatolia and Egypt could be obtained. The route continued south to Egypt itself, where the relationship between the Minoans and the Egyptian court was evidently close. Egyptian records mention the Keftiu, a people from an island in the midst of the Great Green Sea, whose representatives came to Egypt bearing gifts. The paintings in Egyptian tombs show these Keftiu men carrying Minoan-style vessels, bull's head rhytons, conical cups, metal jars, to present to the pharaoh. Their clothing, their physical type, their objects are all recognizably Minoan. The Keftiu are the Minoans seen through Egyptian eyes. What the Minoans got in return is equally important. Egypt could supply papyrus and linen and grain and ostrich eggs and elephant ivory and gold from the Sudan. The Levant could supply the tin that, combined with Cypriot copper, produced bronze. The Aegean islands and the Greek mainland could supply silver and obsidian. The Black Sea region, reached perhaps through intermediaries, could supply amber. The Minoan world was, in the fullest sense, a world economy, a system of exchange that linked the cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean, from Egypt to Anatolia, into a single interconnected network of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. And Crete, at the center of this network, pulling resources in from every direction and sending out in return the sophisticated products of its craft industries, was its heart. The wealth this generated was enormous. The palaces were not built with local resources alone. The gold in the treasury, the ivory in the workshops, the tin in the bronze alloy of every tool and weapon on the island, all of this came from outside, purchased with the surplus of the Cretan agricultural economy and the products of the Cretan craft workshops. The Minoan palace economy was, in a very real sense, a global enterprise. Of all the dimensions of Minoan civilization, the religion is the most tantalizing and the most frustrating to reconstruct. Tantalizing because the religious imagery of the Minoan world is rich, vivid, and clearly significant. The frescoes, the seal stones, the figurines, the ritual objects all speak of a religious life that was complex, emotionally intense, and central to the culture's sense of itself. Frustrating because we cannot read the language in which the religion was expressed, and because the images themselves, for all their richness, resist confident interpretation. What follows is therefore necessarily partial and provisional. We can describe what we see, we can propose interpretations, but we must hold those interpretations loosely, acknowledging that the people who actually participated in this religion are not available to explain it to us. The most prominent figure in Minoan religious imagery is a goddess, or perhaps several goddesses, who may represent different aspects of a single divine principle, or may be genuinely distinct beings. She appears in multiple forms and contexts. She appears as the mistress of animals, a figure flanked by wild creatures, often lions or griffins, whose posture suggests dominion over the natural world. She appears in contexts associated with mountains and mountaintop sanctuaries, the peak sanctuaries that the Minoans built on the summits of hills and mountains across Crete, depositing there figurines of humans and animals as offerings to a divine presence associated with the heights. She appears, most dramatically, in the image of the snake goddess, the famous figurines from the palace repositories at Knossos, showing a female figure holding snakes, her arms extended, her chest bare, her skirts flounced, her gaze direct and commanding. These are not small objects. They are substantial, carefully made, rendered with an attention to detail. The patterns of the snake's scales, the embroidery of the skirt, the specific posture of the hands, that suggests they were important cult objects, representing a being of considerable religious significance. Snakes, in the ancient Mediterranean world, had complex and layered associations. They were chthonic creatures, beings of the earth, associated with the underworld, with the dead, with the primordial powers that existed before the gods of the sky. They shed their skins and were thus associated with renewal and transformation. They appeared in houses and were regarded, in many Mediterranean cultures, as guardians of the domestic space, protective spirits of the household. The snake goddess of the Minoans held all of these associations. She was a goddess of the earth, of the home, of transformation, of the power that flows up from underground, in a civilization that sat atop the geologically unstable platform of the Aegean, where earthquakes were a recurring, terrifying reality. A goddess with dominion over the forces beneath the earth was not an abstraction but a practical necessity. There was also, clearly, a powerful masculine divine element in Minoan religion, though it appears in the imagery less frequently and less prominently than the feminine. The bull was the central sacred animal of the Minoan world, and the bull was associated with a divine masculine power. The great horns of consecration, a distinctive pair of curved stone horns that appears repeatedly in Minoan religious contexts, on palace facades, on altars, on ritual objects, pointed to the sky in a gesture of divine invocation. The bull leaping was almost certainly a religious ritual as much as an athletic display. The young male god, sometimes called the boy god in the scholarly literature, appears in Minoan imagery as a figure associated with the natural world, with vegetation and renewal, with the cyclical death and rebirth of the agricultural year. His myth, if it was indeed a myth, may have told a story of a divine youth who died and was reborn, whose life and death were tied to the seasons, whose fate the ritual calendar of the Minoan year dramatized and reenacted. This pattern, the great goddess and her younger male companion, whose death and resurrection she mourned and celebrated, is found in related forms across the ancient Near East. The Sumerian Inanna and Dumuzi, the Phrygian Cybele and Attis, the Syrian Astarte and Adonis, the later Greek Demeter and Persephone, whose story retains clear structural parallels. Whether these are all manifestations of a single, very ancient mythological pattern, diffused across the Bronze Age world through trade and cultural contact, or whether they represent independent convergences of similar agricultural mythologies, is debated. What seems clear is that the Minoan religion was deeply embedded in the natural world, in the cycles of the seasons, in the life of animals, in the growth and decay of plants, in the forces that moved beneath the earth, and occasionally, terrifyingly, expressed themselves as earthquakes. The divine was not separate from the natural world. It was present within it, animating it, expressing itself through the movements of animals and the rhythms of the agricultural year. The sacred spaces of the Minoan world reflected this understanding. The peak sanctuaries were among the most important religious sites in Crete, located on prominent hilltops, many of them visible from the palaces below. They were places where the divine presence of the mountain was particularly concentrated, where the distance between the human world and the divine world narrowed. Votaries climbed to these heights and left offerings, figurines of humans and animals, sometimes modeled in very rough clay, as though the important thing was the intention rather than the craftsmanship. Sometimes elaborately made and clearly expensive, these offerings accumulated over centuries, creating dense deposits of religious material that archaeologists have been excavating and interpreting since the early 20th century. The cave sanctuaries were equally important. Crete is riddled with caves. The island's limestone geology is conducive to cave formation, and the Minoans used many of them as sacred places. The Psychro cave in the mountains of eastern Crete, which was later identified in Greek tradition as the cave where Zeus was born and hidden from his father Kronos, shows evidence of Minoan ritual activity going back deep into the Bronze Age. Offerings accumulated there as they did at the peak sanctuaries. Figurines, bronze objects, pottery, jewelry, the physical debris of centuries of religious practice. The palace itself was a sacred space, not merely an administrative one. The rituals performed in the central court, around the altars and the sacred trees that appear in frescoes and on seal stones, the ceremonies involving the great bulls, the processions of richly dressed figures that moved through the painted corridors. All of these gave the palace a religious dimension that was inseparable from its economic and political functions. In the Minoan world, as in most ancient worlds, these categories, the sacred, the economic, the political, were not the separate, cleanly defined domains that modern thought tends to treat them as. They were aspects of a single integrated reality. The palace was simultaneously a market, a temple, a seat of government, a center of craft production, a granary, and a stage for the great religious performances that gave the entire community its sense of shared meaning and shared identity. There is a place in the Aegean world that, when you understand what it contains, seems almost too perfect to be real. On the southern part of the island of Thera, the island that the catastrophic Bronze Age volcanic eruption created, and that modern visitors know as Santorini, there is a site called Crete. It is a Bronze Age town that was buried, intact, under layers of volcanic ash and pumice, when the volcano on the island erupted sometime around the 17th or 16th century BC. The date of the eruption is, in fact, one of the most contentious questions in Bronze Age studies. Traditional archaeological dating, based on the pottery styles found above and below the ash layers at various sites, placed the eruption around 1500 BC, a date that fits comfortably with other events in the Bronze Age chronology. More recent scientific dating, using radiocarbon analysis of organic materials found in the ash and ice core records from Greenland that appear to preserve a record of the eruption's atmospheric effects, suggests a date around 1600 BC, 100 years earlier. 100 years is not a trivial difference. It matters for how we understand the relationship between the volcanic eruption and the decline of Minoan civilization, as we will see shortly. But for the moment, let us simply visit Crete as it was in the moments before the volcano changed everything. Crete was a substantial town, a Minoan-influenced settlement of considerable sophistication, with multi-story buildings, paved streets, a sophisticated drainage system, and an artistic tradition that drew deeply on Minoan models while also expressing a distinctly Cycladic sensibility. The buildings of Crete were not modest structures. They were multi-story, built of stone and mud brick, with wooden framing elements and walls that were plastered and painted with frescoes. The buildings had windows, real windows with wooden frames, opening onto the street or onto interior courts. Some buildings had elaborate polychrome facades. The town had a character that was urban in the full sense, a place where people lived in close proximity, where commercial activity and social interaction occurred in structured public spaces. The frescoes of Crete are among the finest paintings to survive from the Bronze Age world. We have already mentioned the spring fresco, the room covered with lilies and swallows, one of the most fully realized landscape paintings of the ancient world. But there are others. The flotilla fresco, a panoramic painting covering the walls of a room in one of the main buildings, shows a miniature world in extraordinary detail. A seaborne procession between two towns, with ships in the harbour, figures watching from the shore, and from boats, dolphins leaping in the water below. The level of detail, the individual features of buildings, the positions of figures, the rigging of boats, is remarkable, suggesting a painter who was working from careful observation, who wanted to show the world as it actually was, rather than as convention dictated. The Boxing Boys fresco shows two young boys facing each other with raised fists, wearing a single boxing glove on one hand each. They are shown with all the energy and specificity of actual athletes. One appears to have a slightly swollen lip, the other is slightly off balance. These are not idealized divine figures. These are people, caught in a moment. The Blue Monkeys fresco, which has a parallel in the Minoan palace tradition, shows a group of monkeys in an elaborate landscape, their blue bodies moving through rocks and plants, with the same vividness that characterizes all the best Minoan-influenced painting. What makes Crete uniquely precious is not just the quality of the art, but the completeness of the preservation. When the volcano erupted, The town's inhabitants apparently had warning. The absence of human remains in the site suggests that the people evacuated before the worst of the eruption. They left behind their buildings, their furniture, their pottery, their grain stores, their equipment. The ash preserved all of it. Excavations at Crete, begun in 1967 and still ongoing, have revealed three-story buildings with their contents intact. Ceramic vessels still arranged on the shelves where they were placed before the evacuation. Wooden furniture preserved as voids in the ash, so that casting reveals their exact form. Storage rooms with their pithoi still in place. It is, in some ways, the Bronze Age equivalent of Pompeii. A civilization caught in its moment, preserved by catastrophe, available to us in a detail and a completeness that no other Bronze Age site can match. But Crete also raises questions that it cannot fully answer. The people who lived here, who painted these beautiful rooms, who arranged these storage jars, who evacuated with enough time to take their most precious possessions but not enough to take everything. Who were they? What language did they speak? What did they call themselves? What did they believe would happen if they prayed to the right gods with sufficient fervor? The ash has preserved their walls and their pottery. It has not preserved their voices. While Minoan civilization was reaching its peak on Crete and spreading its cultural influence across the Aegean world, something was developing on the Greek mainland that would eventually transform the entire Bronze Age world. The Mycenaeans. The name comes from Mycenae, the citadel in the Argolid, in the northeastern Peloponnese, excavated by Heinrich Schliemann in the 1870s, where the famous shaft graves were discovered, filled with gold masks and bronze weapons, and the accumulated wealth of a warrior aristocracy that had clearly grown very rich very quickly. The Mycenaeans were Greek-speaking peoples. Their language is attested in the Linear B tablets, which are written in an early form of Greek. They were heirs to a mainland tradition that had been developing through the Bronze Age, and that had been absorbing, from the early second millennium onward, increasingly strong cultural influences from the Minoan world across the sea. The relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans is one of the most contested questions in Aegean archaeology. For much of the 20th century, scholars followed Evans in seeing the relationship as one of Minoan dominance, a thalassocracy that extended its cultural and perhaps political control over the mainland, influencing and in some senses civilizing the rougher, more warlike people of the Greek mainland. The Mycenaeans, on this view, were recipients of Minoan civilizations, students who learnt from their Cretan teachers and eventually surpassed them. More recent scholarship has complicated this picture considerably. The early Mycenaeans, the people buried in the shaft graves at Mycenae around 1600 BC, contemporary with the height of Neopalatial Minoan civilizations, were clearly not passive recipients of Minoan influence. They were warriors. Their burials are full of weapons, swords, daggers, spearheads, of a type that is not found in quantity in Minoan contexts. They hunted lions that do not appear to have been native to Greece, suggesting either hunting expeditions to North Africa or lions imported and maintained as prestige animals. They drove chariots. They accumulated wealth with an intensity that speaks of conquest and raid and the kind of competitive warrior culture that we recognize from, for example, the Celtic world. These were not the peaceful, bull-leaping, dolphin-painting people of Minoan imagination. They were something harder and more aggressive, and yet they absorbed Minoan culture with an avidity that speaks of genuine admiration. The shaft grave burials are full of Minoan objects and Minoan-influenced objects. Gold cups in Minoan style, carved seal stones from Crete, bronze daggers with inlaid scenes in Minoan technique showing hunting and nature scenes of the most sophisticated kind. The people buried in the shaft graves wanted Minoan things. They wanted to be associated with Minoan civilization, to demonstrate their access to it, to wrap themselves in its prestige. This is not the behavior of people who feel conquered or dominated. It is the behavior of admirers, people who see in the culture of their neighbors something they want to possess and emulate. The relationship between the Minoans and the Mycenaeans in the Neopalatial period was probably one of complex multi-layered contact, trade, cultural borrowing, diplomatic exchange, perhaps intermarriage at the elite level, perhaps Minoan craftsmen working in mainland workshops and mainland warriors visiting Crete. It was not simple domination in either direction. But around 1450 BC, something changed. At sites across Crete, there is evidence of destruction, burning, abandonment, disruption. The scale and simultaneity of the destructions suggest not merely earthquake or internal conflict, but something more targeted and more violent. At Knossos, The palace continued to function after these destructions, but in a changed form. The Linear B tablets found at Knossos show that by this phase, the palace administration was being conducted in Greek, in the Mycenaean language, suggesting that the palace had passed under Mycenaean control, or was now being run by Mycenaean administrators. The exact sequence of events, who destroyed the Cretan palaces around 1450 BC, how and why Knossos came to be controlled by Mycenaean speakers, whether this represents a conquest or a coup, or a more gradual shift in control, is debated with a heat that suggests the academic stakes are higher than merely factual. The question of whether the Minoans were conquered by the Mycenaeans, or absorbed them peacefully, or invited them, or were betrayed from within, is one that touches on questions of cultural priority and civilizational identity that still carry weight. What is certain is that after about 1400 BC, the Mycenaeans were the dominant power in the Aegean. Knossos continued as a major center under Mycenaean administration for perhaps another century before its final destruction around 1375 BC. The Mycenaean civilization, the civilization of Agamemnon and Achilles, of Tiryns and Mycenae, of the great mainland citadels, was the direct heir of the Minoan world, absorbing its art, its administrative techniques, its religious traditions, its maritime connections, and transforming all of these into something that was recognizably descended from its Minoan origins, but also distinctly, powerfully its own. The Minoans did not simply disappear, they were transformed. Their DNA, their knowledge, their artistic traditions, their religious practices flowed into the civilization that would eventually become classical Greece, and, through it, into the entire subsequent tradition of Western civilization. The Minoans are our ancestors, in ways that go far deeper than merely genetic. The question of what ended the Minoan world is the most dramatic and the most contested in all of Bronze Age archaeology. It has attracted not just scholars, but enthusiasts of every variety. People who want the ending to be a natural catastrophe, people who want it to be a human conflict, people who want it to be connected to the legend of Atlantis, people who want it to be a simple and satisfying story with a clear villain and a definitive date. The reality is, as usual, more complicated and more interesting than any of these tidy narratives. Let us lay out what we know. The Minoan world reached its peak, culturally, economically, and in terms of geographical reach, in the Neopalatial period, roughly 1700 to 1400 BC. The palaces were functioning, the trade networks were active, the art was being produced. The administrative system was recording and managing the flow of goods across the island and beyond. Then came a series of destructions. The first major disruption is associated with the eruption of the Thera volcano, the catastrophic eruption of the volcanic island 60 miles north of Crete that buried a Crotia and sent enormous quantities of ash into the atmosphere. This eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, significantly larger than the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which is itself a benchmark of geological violence. It produced tsunamis, atmospheric cooling, and an ash cloud that covered large areas of the Aegean. Whether this eruption destroyed the Minoan palace civilization or merely disrupted it remains debated. The dating problem, the 100-year uncertainty between the archaeological date of around 1500 BC and the scientific date of around 1600 BC, is crucial here. If the eruption occurred around 1600 BC, then Minoan civilization clearly survived it by a century or more, since the Neopalatial palaces continued to function and produce art and records until around 1400 to 1300 BC. If the eruption occurred around 1500 BC, then its relationship to the subsequent destructions is closer and potentially more causal. The tsunami generated by the Thera eruption would have been devastating to Minoan coastal settlements. The ash fallout, depending on wind patterns, would have damaged agriculture in affected areas. The atmospheric cooling that follows major volcanic eruptions can disrupt agricultural cycles for years. These effects were real and would have had significant impacts on Minoan society, regardless of the precise dating. But the Minoans had survived catastrophe before. The first palaces had been destroyed around 1700 BC and were rebuilt, more magnificently than before, almost immediately. A civilization that had demonstrated that kind of resilience was not easily eliminated by a single natural disaster. The destruction of the Cretan palaces around 1450 BC, the destruction that seems to have brought most of the Neopalatial palatial system to an end, is not easily explained by the Thera eruption alone, especially if the eruption was a century and a half earlier. Other explanations have been proposed. Human agency, specifically Mycenaean invasion or takeover, is supported by the evidence of Mycenaean control at Knossos after the destructions. If the Mycenaeans from the mainland swept across Crete, destroying the other palaces and establishing their control at Knossos, this would explain both the pattern of destructions and the subsequent evidence of Mycenaean administration. But the evidence for a specific military conquest is not conclusive. The destructions at the various Cretan palatial sites are not all precisely contemporary, suggesting a more complex and drawn-out process rather than a single coordinated attack. Some sites were abandoned rather than violently destroyed. The picture is messy in the way that real history usually is. Internal conflict within the Minoan world is another possibility. The competitive tensions between different regional centers, Knossos versus Phaistos versus the eastern palaces, may have produced conflict that the Mycenaeans exploited rather than initiated. A Crete weakened by internal conflict would have been vulnerable to outside intervention. Climate change, the kind of prolonged drought or agricultural disruption that has been implicated in the collapse of other Bronze Age civilizations, may also have played a role. The late Bronze Age collapse of around 1200 BC, which brought down not just the Minoan world, but the Mycenaean civilization, the Hittite Empire, and numerous other Bronze Age civilizations within a relatively short span of time, is now widely attributed to a combination of climate change, drought, disruption of trade networks, and the movements of the so-called Sea Peoples. The earlier Minoan collapse, if it is indeed a collapse rather than a transformation, may be an early expression of the same complex of destabilizing forces. The honest answer is, we do not know with certainty what ended the Minoan world. We know that the Neo-Palatial system came to an end around 1400 to 1300 BC. We know that Knossos continued under Mycenaean administration for some time after the destruction of the other palaces. We know that Minoan culture, in a transformed form, survived the end of the palatial system. The post-palatial period shows the continuation of many Minoan artistic and religious traditions, even without the palace infrastructure. And we know that by 1200 BC, the entire Bronze Age civilizational network of the eastern Mediterranean was in collapse. The Mycenaean citadels on the mainland were being destroyed. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia was falling. The great trading cities of the Levantine coast were being attacked. Egypt was fighting for its life against the Sea Peoples. The mysterious migrations of people from somewhere in the Aegean and Anatolian world who swept across the eastern Mediterranean, destroying the interconnected trading system that had sustained Bronze Age civilization. When that system collapsed, the Minoans, or rather, the Cretan communities that carried Minoan cultural traditions, lost the trade networks, the exchange of goods and ideas, the economic interconnections that had made the palatial civilization possible. Without the palace economies, without the trade that fed the palace workshops, without the administrative infrastructure that had managed the flow of resources, the distinctive features of Minoan civilization faded. The age of the palaces was over. What survived was something simpler, more local, less spectacular, but still, in its way, Minoan. The villages and farmsteads of Crete continued. The people continued. They carried with them memories, in their pottery styles, in their religious practices, in the stories they told, of a world that had been extraordinary, but the world itself was gone. No discussion of the Minoans can pass without addressing the most famous theory connecting them to the ancient world's most enduring myth, Atlantis. The legend of Atlantis comes from Plato, writing in the 4th century BC. In two dialogues, the Timaeus and the unfinished Critias, Plato describes a great civilization on a large island in the Atlantic Ocean, west of the Pillars of Hercules. Atlantis, he says, was a powerful maritime civilization that had conquered much of the Mediterranean world before being destroyed in a single day and night by earthquakes and floods, sinking beneath the sea. Plato attributes the story to the Athenian statesman Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, who told him it had occurred 9,000 years before his time. The theory that Atlantis is a mythologized memory of Minoan civilization, specifically of the destruction caused by the Thera eruption, has been influential since the 1960s, when the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos proposed it, and a popular book by James Mavor brought it to wide public attention. The parallels are striking enough to be interesting. The Minoans were a great maritime civilization. The Thera eruption was a catastrophic event that destroyed an island. The Minoan palatial civilization did, in historical terms, decline and ultimately disappear. The timescale, if Plato's 9,000 years is compressed to 900, a factor of 10 error, or a translation error between Egyptian years and Greek years, lands approximately in the Bronze Age. A geographical discrepancy. Plato places Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, while the Aegean is the Mediterranean, is significant and troubling for the theory. Some proponents have argued that the direction was garbled in transmission, or that Plato added the Atlantic location for rhetorical purposes. Others have argued that this discrepancy effectively rules out the Aegean identification. The most significant problem with the Atlantis-Minoan identification, however, is a simpler one. Plato almost certainly invented Atlantis. This is the conclusion of the majority of classical scholars. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian. The Atlantis story in the Timaeus and Critias serves specific philosophical and political purposes. It is a vehicle for Plato's ideas about ideal and corrupted states, about Athenian virtue, about the dangers of hubris and imperial overreach. The story has the shape and function of a philosophical fable, not a historical record. Its details, the concentric rings of land and water, the precise measurements, the specific metals and animals and geographical features, are suspiciously perfect for a mythological account that was supposedly transmitted through thousands of years of oral tradition. None of this means that the Minoans are not a fascinating and important civilization. They are, indisputably. None of it means that the Thera eruption was not a dramatic and consequential event. It was, unquestionably. None of it means that Bronze Age civilizations do not produce legends. They do, as the stories of Troy and the flood demonstrate. But the Atlantis connection is, in the end, a distraction. The Minoans do not need the legend of Atlantis to be extraordinary. Their actual story, the palaces, the art, the trade networks, the bull leaping, the writing systems, the goddesses and the snakes, is extraordinary enough. The danger of the Atlantis theory is not that it is wrong. It is that it substitutes a romantic myth for the more difficult, more rewarding, and ultimately more fascinating reality. The Minoans are not a legend. They were people. They lived. They built. They created. They prayed. They loved. They died. They did all of this in a world we are still, after a century of archaeology, only beginning to understand. That is a better story than Atlantis. It is harder, and stranger, and truer. The palaces are the most visible monuments of Minoan civilization. They are what draws the archaeologist's spade and the tourist's eye. They are what fills the museum cases and illustrates the textbooks. But a palace is not a civilization. It is the concentrated expression of a civilization that extends far beyond its own walls. To understand the Minoans fully, we need to follow the roads that lead away from Knossos, along the northern coast, and up into the hills and down to the harbour settlements, to the towns and villages where the majority of Minoan life was actually lived. The town of Malaya, about 30 kilometers east of Knossos along the northern coast, had its own palace, smaller than Knossos but following the same essential organizational logic, with a central court surrounded by storerooms and residential areas and craft workshops. But Malaya also had a town surrounding its palace, a substantial settlement whose streets and houses have been partially excavated, and that give us a picture of Minoan urban life that the palace alone cannot provide. The streets of Minoan Malaya were laid out with a degree of planning that is surprising for a Bronze Age settlement. There is a main street, wide, paved, clearly the major circulation route, and secondary streets branching off it in ways that suggest a community that had been growing for a long time, and that had developed, through use and adaptation, a reasonably coherent urban structure. The buildings along the streets were multi-purpose. Houses that also served as workshops, shops that also served as residences, the mixed-use density that characterizes urban life in most pre-modern cultures. One of the most interesting structures at Malaya is the so-called agora, a large open space adjacent to the palace that may have served as a place of public assembly, of market activity, of the kind of communal gathering that gave Minoan social life its texture. It is not an agora in the Greek sense. The word is an anachronism, and the function of the space was probably significantly different from the role of the Greek marketplace. But it suggests that the space between the palace and the ordinary town was not merely empty. It was used, organized, and significant. Gornia, in the eastern part of Crete, gives us a different but equally valuable window into Minoan town life. Gornia was excavated in the early 20th century by the American archaeologist Harriet Boyd Hawes, one of the first women to lead a major archaeological excavation, and what was revealed was a small Minoan town of perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 people packed onto a hillside above the Gulf of Mirabello. Gornia is remarkable for its completeness. The streets, the houses, the small town shrine, the workshops, All of these are visible in a way that they are not at the larger, more intensively excavated sites. The town has a palace, very small by Knossos standards, perhaps the residence of a local governor or administrator rather than a major palatial centre. And around it, the town spreads in closely packed blocks of houses, separated by narrow lanes. The houses of Gornia tell us a great deal about ordinary Minoan life. They are small, 2 to 5 rooms typically, built in stone to the ground floor level, and probably in mud brick above. They had stone-paved floors in some rooms. They had hearths for cooking and heating. They had storage areas where ceramic vessels and equipment were kept. The inhabitants of these houses were, in many cases, craftsmen. The evidence of their work is preserved in the materials found in their houses: bronze-working equipment, stone-working tools, weaving implements, the raw materials and the finished and semi-finished products of small-scale industrial production. Gornia was a town of makers, people who produced things, not for the palace alone, but for their own community and for the regional economy. A knife maker lived here, a bronze worker there, a weaver in that house, the loom weights still on the floor where they fell when the town was finally abandoned, a potter in the building at the edge of the lane, the clay still bearing the fingerprints of the person who shaped it. These are the ordinary Minoans, not the elite who wore the gold torques and carried the carved seal stones, not the scribes who kept the palace records, not the bull leapers or the goddess priests or the administrators of the redistribution economy. The ordinary people, skilled, hard-working, embedded in a community that they maintained through their daily labor and their daily social interactions. They are harder to see than the palace elite, but they are there, in the fingerprints on the clay and the loom weights on the floor and the narrow streets that still hold the shape of their daily movements after 3,500 years. The harbour towns of Crete were the interface between the island and the wider world. Places like Komos, on the south coast of Crete, served as ports, places where ships were built and repaired and loaded and unloaded, where goods from Egypt and the Levant arrived and goods from the Cretan interior departed. Komos has been extensively excavated, and the results are informative about the scale of Minoan maritime activity. The site shows evidence of monumental storage buildings, structures large enough to hold significant quantities of goods, or perhaps to serve as ship sheds, sheltering the vessels from the harsh Mediterranean weather during the winter when sailing was suspended. The pottery found at Komos includes significant quantities of Minoan wares, alongside Cypriot, Levantine, and Egyptian material, reflecting the cosmopolitan character of a functioning international port. The people who worked at Komos, the sailors and the dock workers, and the merchants and the scribes who kept track of arriving and departing cargoes, were living in the most cosmopolitan corner of an already cosmopolitan world. They encountered people from different cultures, speaking different languages, wearing different clothes, worshipping different gods. They managed the movement of goods that had come from as far as the tin mines of Afghanistan and the gold sources of Nubia, and they sent out goods that would end up in Egyptian tombs and Levantine palaces and Greek mainland citadels. This international orientation, this comfort with difference, this experience of the world as larger than any one place or any one culture, is part of the Minoan character. It is reflected in the art, which absorbs and transforms influences from Egypt and the Near East without losing its distinctly Minoan voice. It is reflected in the religion, which shows parallels with Near Eastern traditions while remaining fundamentally its own. It is the product of 500 years of active participation in the Bronze Age world economy. We have already discussed the major outlines of Minoan religion: the goddess, the bull, the sacred landscapes. But the religious life of the Minoans deserves more detailed examination, because it was pervasive in a way that makes the modern category of religion inadequate for describing it. In the modern world, at least in the secular West, religion is typically treated as a separate domain of life. You practice your religion on certain days, in certain buildings, at certain times. The rest of the time, you live your secular life, working, eating, socializing, in a space that is not primarily defined by religious categories. For the Minoans, as for most ancient peoples, this separation did not exist. The religious and the everyday were inseparable. The ritual and the practical were not different activities. The act of pressing olives or weaving cloth or sailing to Egypt was not a secular act that happened alongside a religious life. It was an activity embedded in a universe of meaning that was fundamentally sacred. The seal stones illustrate this beautifully. These are, functionally, administrative tools. They were pressed into clay to mark documents and vessels, identifying their owner and authorizing their contents. But the images carved on the seal stones are not administrative images. They are religious images, goddesses, sacred trees, ritual performances, supernatural creatures. Every time a Minoan official pressed a seal stone into clay, they were performing an act that was simultaneously administrative and religious. The two were inseparable. The sacred tree was one of the most important religious symbols in the Minoan world, and it appears in contexts that range from elaborate palace ceremonies to small domestic rituals. On seal stones and gold rings, the tree appears in what scholars call the Epiphany scenes, scenes in which a divine figure descends from the sky or emerges from the tree itself, appearing to human worshippers who respond with ecstatic gestures. The tree is the locus of divine presence, a natural object that can at certain moments and in certain ritual contexts become a threshold between the human world and the divine world. This understanding of sacred trees connects the Minoan religious tradition to a very wide range of ancient and modern religious practices. The sacred grove of the Celts, the world tree of Norse mythology, the sacred fig tree beneath which the Buddha achieved enlightenment, the tree as axis mundi, as connection between earth and heaven, as the living symbol of the relationship between the natural world and the divine. This is a concept that appears in religious traditions across the globe. For the Minoans, the specific trees that carried this sacred significance were the olive and the fig, the two most important cultivated trees of the Mediterranean world, trees whose care and cultivation had occupied human attention for millennia, and whose products, oil and fruit, were central to both the economy and the diet. By making these trees sacred, the Minoan religion was doing what religions very often do, finding the divine in the most important and most familiar elements of the material world. The lustral basin, a distinctive architectural feature found in Minoan palaces and in important Minoan houses, is another window into the way the sacred and the everyday intersected in Minoan life. The lustral basin is a small sunken room, reached by a short staircase descending below the floor level, with stone-lined walls and a floor that could be cleaned or kept separate from the surrounding spaces. Evans interpreted them as bathrooms or bathing chambers, but this interpretation is now generally rejected. The basins do not have drainage adequate for actual bathing, and their contexts are consistently ceremonial rather than hygienic. The current interpretation is that lustral basins were spaces for ritual purification, for the kind of ceremonial washing that preceded religious activity in many ancient traditions. Before entering a sacred space, before performing a ritual, before engaging in an act with religious significance, you descended into the lustral basin, performed the necessary purificatory acts, and emerged ready to engage with the sacred. This need for ritual preparation before engaging with the sacred is universal in ancient religion. The Jewish mikveh, the Islamic ablutions before prayer, the Hindu ritual bathing in sacred rivers, all of these are expressions of the same fundamental religious intuition that the divine is different from the everyday, that approaching it requires a transition, a preparation, a leaving behind of the ordinary state. The Minoans built this transition into the architecture of their most important spaces. The lustral basin was not an accessory to the palace, it was integral to it. You could not fully participate in the religious and administrative life of the palace without passing through the purification ritual of the lustral basin. The mountain goddess, the divine presence associated with the peaks and the heights, was approached through a different kind of sacred space, the peak sanctuary. The peak sanctuaries of Crete are, in their physical setting, among the most dramatic sacred spaces in the ancient world. They are located on prominent hilltops, many of them visible from the palaces below, so that the palace and the peak sanctuary were in a constant visual relationship, and they served as the places where the divine presence of the mountain was most concentrated and most accessible. The offerings deposited at peak sanctuaries over the centuries of their use represent an extraordinary accumulation of devotional activity. Figurines, of humans in postures of prayer and supplication, of animals, of body parts, hands, feet, faces, ears, whose deposition may represent pleas for healing, have been found in their thousands. Bronze objects, clay vessels, miniature versions of the animals and implements of everyday life. The body part offerings are particularly interesting. The practice of offering the representation of an afflicted body part to a healing deity is found in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, in medieval Christian pilgrimage sites, and in many modern religious contexts around the world. It is one of the most widespread and most enduring religious practices in human history. To find it in Bronze Age Crete is to find another thread in the long human story of seeking divine help for physical suffering. The peak sanctuaries were not restricted to the elite. The quality of the votive offerings ranges from the beautifully made to the crudely formed. a lump of clay with a vaguely human shape that someone made quickly, without skill, but with the intensity of genuine need. The peak sanctuary was a place you could go with your clay and your desperation and your hope, and leave something behind for the goddess, and walk back down the mountain with whatever peace you could find in having done so. This is religion at its most basic and most universal. Not theology, not institution, not orthodoxy, just a person and a hilltop and a hope. The Minoan world was organized around the rhythms of the agricultural and pastoral year, and those rhythms were marked by festivals and ceremonies that gave the community its sense of shared time and shared identity. We do not have a Minoan calendar in the way that we have, for example, the Athenian calendar or the Roman calendar. The linear tablets, whatever they record, have not yielded a clear picture of how the Minoans organized and named their months and seasons, but from the art, from the evidence of the peak sanctuaries and the agricultural cycles, and from comparison with later Greek and Near Eastern traditions that may preserve Minoan-influenced elements, we can sketch the outlines of how the Minoan year was experienced. Spring was the season of renewal and of the return of life after the dormancy of winter. The crocus harvest, the gathering of the saffron-bearing crocus that provided one of the most valuable substances in the ancient Mediterranean economy, was a spring activity. The crocus gatherer fresco from Crete shows young women gathering crocus blossoms in a landscape bursting with the abundance of the new season. It is a spring image, vivid with the specific joy of a season that has been anticipated through the cold and scarcity of winter. Saffron was extraordinarily valuable. It was used as a dye, producing a golden yellow color that was highly prized. It was used as a flavoring in food and drink. It had medicinal applications. It was used in religious ceremonies. The giving of saffron to divine figures appears in Minoan religious imagery. A substance so valuable, so carefully cultivated, so deeply embedded in both the economy and the religious life of the community, would naturally have its own ceremonial context, its own marking in the sacred calendar. Summer was the season of work, of the care and cultivation of the olive groves and the vineyards, of the harvesting of grain, of the preparation of the products that would fill the palace magazines and sustain the community through the year. The harvester vase from Hagia Triada depicts what seems to be a harvest procession, a group of men carrying their tools and singing, led by a figure with a ritual staff, moving with the energy of people engaged in work that has both practical and ceremonial dimensions. The harvest was not merely agricultural. It was an act of communal significance, a moment when the community's survival was made concrete, when the abstract relationship between human labor and natural abundance was expressed in the tangible reality of grain cut and fruit gathered and oil pressed. The rituals associated with the harvest, the first fruits offerings, the ceremonies of thanksgiving, the festivals that marked the end of the agricultural year, were expressions of the community's relationship with the divine forces that governed the fertility of the land. The olive harvest in particular, occurring in late autumn when the olives had ripened to the point of maximum oil content, would have been a major communal event. The pressing of the olives, the filling of the great pithoi with the new oil, the offering of the first oil to the gods, all of this had a ceremonial dimension that went far beyond mere practical agricultural activity. Winter was the season of the sea's closure, when storms made sailing dangerous and the maritime connections that sustained the Minoan economy were temporarily severed. It was a season of conservation, of living on stored resources, of craft work that could be done indoors. It was also perhaps the season of storytelling, of the long evenings when the accumulated wisdom of the culture was transmitted in the form of narrative, when the mythological traditions that gave meaning to the year's rhythms were rehearsed and elaborated and passed to the next generation. The transition points of the year, the solstices and equinoxes, and the agricultural pivots that marked the beginnings and ends of the growing and harvesting seasons, were almost certainly marked by the great religious festivals. The bull leaping, with its associations of solar energy and sacred power, may have been connected to specific moments in the sacred calendar. The ceremonies at the peak sanctuaries may have been associated with the transitions of the season. The epiphany scenes on the seal stones, the moments when the divine figure descends to be present with the worshippers, may represent the specific ritual moments of the year when the divine was believed to be particularly accessible. We cannot reconstruct the Minoan sacred calendar in its specifics. We can only sense its presence in the art, in the architecture, in the structure of a society that was organized around the rhythms of nature and that expressed those rhythms through the medium of ceremony and art. The Minoans were, by any measure, among the most elaborately dressed and most extravagantly adorned peoples of the ancient world. This is not merely an impression created by the artistic conventions of the frescoes. The material evidence, the actual fragments of textile, the actual pieces of jewelry, the actual objects used for personal adornment that have been found in Minoan archaeological contexts, confirms that the elaborate dress depicted in the paintings was real. The Minoans invested substantial resources in materials, in craft labor, in technical knowledge, in the construction and maintenance of personal appearance. The clothing of the Minoan elite, as shown in the frescoes, was technically complex. The flounced skirts worn by women required precise cutting and stitching to create the multiple tiers of fabric that fall in their characteristic overlapping layers. The patterns on the fabric, geometric designs, floral motifs, bands of color, required sophisticated weaving techniques and, in many cases, the use of dyes. The dyeing traditions of the ancient Mediterranean world are technically demanding. To produce stable, vivid colors requires either mineral dyes, derived from metals and metallic compounds, or organic dyes from plant or animal sources. The most prestigious color in the ancient Mediterranean was purple, derived from the murex sea snail, and requiring enormous quantities of the animal to produce small amounts of dye. Minoan trade connections with the Levantine coast, where the purple dye industry was centered, gave elite Minoans access to this most prestigious of colors. The open-fronted bodice worn by women in Minoan art has generated considerable scholarly discussion. It appears consistently across multiple centuries of artistic representation, suggesting that it was a genuine and stable element of Minoan female dress, rather than an artistic convention. Its function and meaning are debated. Some scholars have interpreted it as specifically ritual clothing, worn in religious contexts, but not in everyday life. Others have argued that it was standard dress for elite women across multiple social contexts. The question of why Minoan artistic convention showed women with exposed breasts is one that cannot be definitively answered from the evidence. It may reflect an actual dress style. It may reflect an artistic convention for depicting women in ritual contexts. It may reflect an understanding of the female body as sacred, in a way that required specific modes of representation. All of these explanations have been proposed, and none has been definitively established. Male dress in Minoan art is simpler. Men typically appear in short kilts or loincloths, their bodies active and unencumbered. The contrast between the elaborate female dress and the simpler male dress may reflect actual social differences, or may reflect artistic conventions for representing gender, or both. The jewelry of the Minoan world was worn by both men and women, and it was extensive. The frescoes show figures adorned with multiple layers of necklaces, with bracelets on both arms, with elaborate earrings and pendants. The gold jewelry found in Minoan graves and hoards confirms the lavishness of these depictions. These were not artistic exaggerations, but realistic representations of how the Minoan elite actually adorned themselves. The wearing of jewelry in the Minoan world was not merely decorative. Jewelry served multiple functions simultaneously. It was a store of wealth, in the form of the precious metals and stones from which it was made. It was a marker of status, indicating the wearer's place in the social hierarchy, through the quality and quantity of their adornment. It was a religious object, with specific amulet properties. Certain stones were believed to have protective or beneficial powers, and wearing them was an act with religious as well as aesthetic dimensions. The seal stone, worn on a necklace or wrist cord, served all of these functions simultaneously. It was jewelry. It was a mark of personal identity and administrative authority, and it was a religious object whose images connected its wearer to the divine beings and sacred activities depicted on its carved surface. The hairstyles of Minoan men and women, as shown in the art, were also elaborate. The long curling locks that fall across the shoulders and backs of Minoan figures, both male and female in most depictions, were almost certainly carefully maintained and probably artificially curled. The fresco of the saffron gatherer at Knossos shows a figure whose blue body and curled hair mark them as a representation of the Blue Boy fresco that Evans initially misidentified as a monkey. Hair of this kind, long, curled, carefully arranged, required regular maintenance and possibly the use of oils or other substances to achieve the desired effect. Personal grooming in the Minoan world was a serious business. The elaborate appearance depicted in the art was not achieved without effort. The mirrors of polished bronze, found in elite Minoan contexts and clearly used for personal grooming, tell us that the Minoans cared about how they looked. The ivory combs and pins found in graves tell us that the arrangement of the hair was considered important enough to merit grave goods. This investment in personal appearance, this commitment to the curated, beautiful body as a form of social and possibly religious expression, is consistent with the broader Minoan aesthetic commitment to beauty as a necessary element of a properly lived life. The adorned body was, like the painted wall and the carved stone vessel, a statement that the world ought to be beautiful, and that making it so was worth the effort. The transmission of culture from one generation to the next is one of the most important processes in any civilization, and the Minoans left some evidence, fragmentary as always, of how this transmission occurred in their world. The most direct evidence is the art itself. Children appear in Minoan imagery, and the way they appear tells us something about how they were understood and treated. The boxing boys fresco from Crete shows children, probably boys, in athletic contest. They are shown with the concentration and the slight clumsiness of actual children learning to compete, not the idealized grace of adult athletes. There is something genuine in their depiction, a quality of observation that suggests these were real children, painted by someone who had watched actual children box. Other images show young people in contexts that suggest initiation or training. The bull-leaping frescoes include figures that some scholars have interpreted as young, not yet fully formed, perhaps in the process of learning the art. The age at which bull leapers trained and performed is unknown, but the demands of the practice suggest a regime of training that would have begun young. The craft traditions of the Minoan world were transmitted through apprenticeship, the direct teaching of skills from master to student in the context of actual work. The extraordinary technical level achieved by Minoan metalworkers, stone carvers, fresco painters and potters could not have been reached without long training, and that training was almost certainly organized around master-apprentice relationships within family or workshop structures. The scribes who maintained the palace records were trained in a specific skill, the writing of lineae, which, however well equipped with symbols adapted from earlier Cretan hieroglyphic, required learning, practice, and constant use. There must have been scribal schools of some kind, or at least organized transmission of the knowledge needed to write and read the script, somewhere, in rooms of the palace that we have not identified, or that have not survived. Young people were learning to form the signs of lineae on clay tablets. The religious knowledge of the Minoans, the knowledge of the rituals, the myths, the proper conduct of the ceremonies at the peak sanctuaries and in the palace, was also transmitted, though in ways we cannot directly observe. The similarity of ritual imagery across different sites and different periods suggests that there was a shared and relatively stable body of religious knowledge being transmitted across generations and across the distance that separated one Minoan community from another. Whether this transmission was organized, whether there were religious specialists, something like the Druids of the Celtic world, who were responsible for the maintenance and transmission of sacred knowledge, or whether it occurred through less formal channels, through participation in communal ritual, and through the accumulated observational learning of childhood, we cannot say. What we can say is that the culture was stable. Over the nearly 1,000 years of the Neopalatial period, the fundamental elements of Minoan visual culture, the artistic conventions, the religious symbols, the architectural traditions, remained recognizable. This stability was achieved through transmission, through the teaching, generation by generation, of what it meant to be Minoan. The Bronze Age Mediterranean world was connected by trade in a way that was genuinely remarkable for its time, a network of exchange that moved goods across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles, linking economies that were, in their ecological bases and their cultural traditions, very different from one another. At the heart of this network, not geographically central, but economically and culturally central, were the Minoans. Let us trace some of the specific goods that moved through the Minoan trade network. Tin was, for the Bronze Age, what oil is for the modern world, a strategic material without which the entire industrial system would collapse. Bronze, the alloy that gave the Bronze Age its name, required approximately 10% tin mixed with 90% copper. Without tin, you could not make bronze. Without bronze, you could not make effective tools or weapons. The collapse of the tin supply would be catastrophic for any Bronze Age civilization. The problem was that tin was rare, and its primary sources in the eastern Mediterranean world were distant and somewhat mysterious. The nearest major tin sources to the Aegean were in Anatolia, in Afghanistan, and, surprisingly distant, in Cornwall in southwestern Britain. The Minoan trade network, extended through multiple intermediary links, may have reached even these remote sources. More certainly, The Minoans were key participants in the trade that moved Cypriot copper across the Mediterranean world. Cyprus, the word copper itself derives from the island's name, was the major copper source for the Bronze Age Aegean economy. Minoan ships almost certainly made regular runs to Cyprus to load the distinctive bronze oxhide ingots, cast in the shape of an outstretched animal hide for ease of handling, that represented the standard form in which copper was traded. The Uluburun shipwreck, a late Bronze Age trading vessel discovered off the southwestern coast of Turkey in 1982 and dating to around 1300 BC, gives us an extraordinary snapshot of the Bronze Age Mediterranean trade. The ship's cargo included 10 tons of Cypriot copper ingots, 1 ton of tin ingots, Canaanite amphorae containing terebinth resin, ebony logs from Egypt or the Sudan, elephant and hippopotamus ivory, gold and silver jewelry, Canaanite jewelry, pottery from Cyprus and Canaan, a scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti, Baltic amber, ostrich eggshells, and weapons and tools. This cargo was assembled at multiple ports across the eastern Mediterranean. It represented the production of multiple civilizations, and its distribution, if the ship had completed its voyage, would have spread these materials across the Aegean world. The Minoans participated in this system, not just as consumers, but as producers and processors. Minoan craft products, the fine pottery, the stone vessels, the textiles, the perfumed oils, the worked ivory and bronze objects, were themselves trade goods that traveled throughout the Aegean and beyond. The pottery is particularly valuable as an indicator of Minoan economic reach, because pottery survives the millennia well and can be identified by its clay, its firing technique, and its decorative style. Minoan pottery has been found at sites stretching from Egypt to Anatolia to the Greek mainland, confirming the geographical extent of the trade network. Perfumed oil, one of the most important luxury commodities of the ancient world, was produced in Minoan palace workshops and exported in distinctive conical riton vessels and in small flasks. The fragrant substances used in the perfume, coriander, sage, juniper, and perhaps more exotic materials imported from the East, were themselves part of the trade system. The production of perfume required raw materials from multiple sources, processed with technical skill in palace workshops, and distributed through a trade network that could reach the courts of Egypt and the cities of the Levant. Purple dye, produced from the murex sea snail, was another luxury commodity for which there is evidence of Minoan involvement. Deposits of crushed murex shells, which are the byproduct of dye production, have been found at Minoan sites. The purple dye industry was labor-intensive and produced small quantities of an intensely valuable product. A small amount of the dye required enormous numbers of the snails to be crushed and processed under conditions that were, by ancient accounts, extraordinarily malodorous. The willingness of the Minoans, or of palace workers under palace direction, to engage in this unpleasant process reflects the extraordinary value of the end product. Purple cloth was the prestige textile of the ancient world. Kings and priests wore it. It was given as diplomatic gifts. It was the marker of the highest social status. For the Minoans, with their deep investment in elaborate dress and personal adornment, access to purple dye was not merely an economic advantage. It was a cultural necessity. The destruction of the Neo-Palatial system around 1400 to 1300 BC did not mean the end of Minoan culture. It meant the end of a particular form of Minoan civilization, the centralized, palace-organized, tightly administered form that had characterized the previous 500 years. But the people remained, the traditions remained, the landscape remained. The post-palatial period on Crete, roughly 1300 to 1100 BC, was a transformed world, but not an empty one. Knossos continued to function as a major center under what was apparently Mycenaean administration. The Linear B tablets from Knossos, dating to this period, show a palace administration conducted in Greek, managing an economy that was still substantial, if somewhat reduced from the Neo-Palatial peak. The Mycenaean rulers of Knossos inherited the infrastructure of the Minoan palatial system and used it for their own purposes. At other sites across Crete, life continued in smaller scale, more locally organized communities. The pottery of the post-palatial period shows a mixture of continuing Minoan traditions and incoming Mycenaean influences, a visual record of cultural blending, of the meeting of the old and the new, of an island culture adapting to its changed circumstances. The towns of eastern Crete, further from the center of Mycenaean power at Knossos, perhaps less thoroughly absorbed into the Mycenaean system, show more persistence of specifically Minoan traditions. The pottery, the religious imagery, The architectural traditions of these eastern communities continued to follow patterns established in the Neopalatial period. Some communities in Crete, after the destruction of the palaces, retreated to defensible hilltop positions, a pattern that suggests the world had become more dangerous, that the security provided by the palace system and the Minoan thalassocracy had been lost, and that communities now needed to provide for their own defense in ways they had not previously needed to. The Karafu site, a post-palatial refuge settlement on a high, easily defended peak in the mountains of Crete, was established after the palatial destructions and shows evidence of a community that was living differently from the neo-palatial world. Smaller, more isolated, more self-sufficient, less connected to the long-distance trade networks that had sustained the palace economy. The religious traditions survived. The peak sanctuaries continued to be used, some of them for centuries after the palace system that had organized their use had disappeared. People still climbed to the heights. They still left their offerings. The goddess of the mountain was still there, still worthy of approach and petition. Even when the palaces that had been the main institutions of her worship were ruins, the linear A script fell out of use. The administrative apparatus of the palace system, the scribes, the record-keeping, the redistribution economy, was gone. In some areas, the Mycenaean linear B replaced it. In others, there was simply silence, the end of writing, the return to a world organized entirely through oral communication and the accumulated authority of tradition. When the final Bronze Age collapse came, around 1200 BC, when the Mycenaean citadels on the mainland were destroyed, when the sea peoples were moving through the eastern Mediterranean, when the trade networks that had sustained Bronze Age civilization were severed, Crete was already transformed. The great Neopalatial civilization was long gone. What remained was a shadow of it, a cultural echo, maintained in the pottery styles and the religious practices and the stories that the people of Crete carried with them into the Iron Age. The Iron Age Cretans were Greeks, or becoming Greeks. The Greek language, brought by the Mycenaeans, was taking hold. The Greek gods, Zeus born in a Cretan cave, Europa brought to Crete by a divine bull, Ariadne in her labyrinth, were absorbing and transforming the older Minoan traditions. But Minoan Crete was not entirely gone. It was present in the substrate, in the patterns of land use, in the memory of the sacred places, in the artistic traditions that the Cretan pottery workshops maintained through the upheavals of the Bronze Age collapse. The Iron Age Cretans were building on Minoan foundations in a literal sense. Many of their communities sat on the same ground as Minoan settlements, and in a cultural sense as well. When, centuries later, classical Greek civilization achieved its brilliant flowering, it was standing on the shoulders of a Bronze Age past that reached, through the Mycenaeans, all the way back to the Minoan world. The Athenians who built the Parthenon were, in ways that none of them could have named or traced, the distant heirs of the palace builders of Knossos. The sea sustained the Minoans in ways that went far beyond the obvious fact of trade. The Aegean Sea in the Bronze Age was not the depleted, overfished body of water that it is becoming today. It was rich, extraordinarily rich in the way that waters that have not yet been subjected to industrial fishing pressure are rich. Tuna and swordfish, grouper and sea bass, red mullet and sea bream, octopus and squid, sponges and sea urchins, mussels and clams, and the ubiquitous murex snail whose dye we have already mentioned. The Minoans fished actively and enthusiastically. The fish remains found in archaeological deposits at coastal Minoan sites confirm a diet in which seafood played a significant role, not merely as a supplementary protein source, but as a central element of the coastal community's food system. The fishing technology of the Minoans included both nets and hook and line fishing. Lead weights, which sink the lower edge of a net, have been found at Minoan sites. Bronze fish hooks of various sizes have been found as well. The boats that the Minoans used for fishing were probably smaller and lighter than the trading vessels that crossed the open Aegean, adapted for working in the sheltered bays and inshore waters where most fishing would have occurred. But the most powerful evidence of the Minoan relationship with the sea is, of course, in the art. The marine imagery of Minoan painting and ceramics is not merely decorative. It reflects a culture that had absorbed the sea into its visual vocabulary with a thoroughness that speaks of genuine, daily, intimate relationship. The people who painted dolphins on palace walls had seen dolphins. The people who made octopus-covered jars had pulled octopuses from the water with their own hands and felt the extraordinary, alien intelligence of the creature in the suckers that gripped their skin. This is observation-based art. This is art made by people who loved the specific creatures of their specific sea. The particular way that a flying fish leaps, its elongated pectoral fins spread like wings, its body cleared entirely from the water for a few extraordinary seconds, is something you cannot paint convincingly without having watched it happen. The Minoan fresco painters watched it happen. They painted it with the precision and the affection of people who found it perpetually astonishing. The Nautilus, that ancient, beautiful creature that builds its spiral shell according to mathematical principles that were not formalized until centuries after the Minoan civilization had ended, appears repeatedly in Minoan art, its cross-section showing the perfect logarithmic spiral that runs through Minoan decorative tradition like a fundamental visual idea. The Minoans did not know the mathematics, but they saw the shell, and they felt in its spiral form the same quality of endless, self-generating movement that they expressed in their decorative art. The sea was a source of beauty, and a source of food, and a source of wealth, but it was also, for the islanders who lived surrounded by it on all sides, something more fundamental than any of these practical categories. It was the element in which their world was embedded. The horizon of the sea was the horizon of their world. The sound of it was the constant background to everything they did and felt and thought. When the Minoan artists put the sea on their walls, they were not merely decorating, they were bringing the most essential feature of their world inside with them, making it part of the domestic space, making the boundary between the human and the natural world permeable, in the same way that their religion made the boundary between the human and the divine permeable. The sea on the wall, and the goddess in the tree, the dolphin in the queen's bathroom, and the snake in the goddess's hand, the bull in the central court, and the octopus on the storage jar. The Minoans lived in a world that refused to be divided into neat categories. The natural and the supernatural, the sacred and the everyday, the inside and the outside, the human and the animal. All of these categories dissolved in the Minoan world, and what remained was a single, unified, vividly beautiful reality that is the gift they tried to leave us. That is what speaks from the painted walls, even now. There is one form of Minoan cultural expression that has left no trace, and that we can only imagine. Their stories. Every human culture tells stories. This is not a learned behavior or a cultural luxury. It is a cognitive necessity, as fundamental to human psychology as language itself. We understand the world through narrative. We transmit knowledge through story. We locate ourselves in time, knowing where we come from and having some sense of where we are going, through the stories that a community tells about itself and to itself. The Minoans told stories. They must have. The religious imagery on their seal stones and frescoes implies myth, implies narrative, implies a story that gives meaning to the images. The goddess who descends from the sky in the Epiphany scenes. What was the story of her descent? What did she want? What did she give? What were the worshippers asking for, and what did they receive? The young god who died and was reborn, if that is indeed the mythological pattern implied by certain Minoan images, had a story. It was a story of death and return, of the world going dark and coming back to life, of the human experience of grief and renewal given cosmic form. What were the details? What were the names of the characters? What were the specific events of the divine biography that gave the annual cycle of the seasons its mythological weight? The great bull, the sacred bull of the central court, had a story. It was not merely an animal. It was a character in a narrative that the Minoans knew and that we do not. Was it a god in animal form? Was it a divine consort of the goddess? Was it the embodiment of a natural force, earthquake, storm, the raw energy of the generative world that had to be ritually engaged and controlled? The labyrinth had a story, long before the Greeks told their version, with Daedalus and Minos and Theseus and Ariadne and the Minotaur. The Minoan palace itself, that endlessly complex building with its branching corridors and its central court and its memories of the double axe, was the setting for a story. What was the Minoan version of that story? What did the building mean to the people who lived and worked in it, who navigated its corridors every day, who knew by heart the path to the storerooms and the path to the sacred spaces, the myths of the sea, the stories of the dolphins and the octopuses, the legends of the sailors who crossed the open water to Egypt and came back with gold, the tales of what lay beyond the horizon, what the seagoing Minoans believed was out there in the wider world, and what supernatural beings guarded the edges of the known. All of this is gone, not merely untranslated, like the Linear tablets, not merely waiting for a ventress to crack the code, gone, not written down, carried only in the memory of a culture that no longer exists, spoken in a language that no longer lives on any human tongue. This loss is absolute in a way that the loss of a written record is not. If Linear A were deciphered tomorrow, we would gain an administrative picture of the Minoan world, records of grain and oil and wool, lists of names, inventories of goods. That would be precious, but it would not give us the myths. The administrative records of a civilization are not its soul. The soul of the Minoan civilization was in the stories they told, and the stories are gone. What remains, what the frescoes and the seal stones and the ritual objects give us, are fragments of the images that accompanied the stories, images without their narrative contexts, characters without their plots, a divine figure descending from the sky, her significance clear but her story unknown, a bull in a field of stylized flowers, charged with meaning we can partially feel but cannot fully name. We are reading the illustrations of a book whose text is lost, and yet the illustrations are so vivid, so beautifully executed, so clearly expressive of a coherent vision of the world, that we cannot help trying to read them. We cannot help feeling that the story is almost there, just beyond our reach, just on the other side of the 3,500 years of silence that separates us from the painters and the storytellers and the ceremony performers of the Neopalatial world. Perhaps this is part of why the Minoans are so compelling. They are present enough to engage us, and absent enough to require us to bring something of ourselves to the encounter. They are a mirror in which we see what we want to see, and also, if we are honest with ourselves, a window into a world that was genuinely different from our own in ways we cannot fully specify. The best mysteries are the ones that remain mysterious even as they reveal themselves. The Minoans are that kind of mystery. We know enough to be captivated. We don't know enough to be certain. And in that space between knowing and not knowing, the dolphins swim, and the bull leaper flies, and the goddess descends, and the spring comes again to the painted lily field. The role of women in Minoan society is one of the most debated and one of the most important questions in Aegean archaeology. The evidence, as always, is ambiguous. We have no written texts to tell us directly what rights women had, what roles they played, what social status they occupied. We have images, frescoes and figurines and seal stones that show women prominently, often in positions that suggest religious authority, social prominence, or economic activity. And we have the figurative ware, the architecture, and the material culture from which inferences can be drawn. The prominence of women in Minoan imagery is undeniable. In the frescoes, women appear not as passive objects, but as active participants, in religious ceremonies, in gatherings that may be civic or social, in what appear to be positions of authority. The famous grandstand fresco from Knossos shows a group of women in elaborate dress in what appears to be a ceremonial setting, with crowds of people behind them. They are not in the background, they are the focus. The figure types in Minoan art follow consistent conventions that suggest these are not random individuals, but recognized social categories. The elaborately dressed women with their flounced skirts and open-topped bodices appear in contexts that suggest they are members of an elite, perhaps a priestly elite, perhaps an aristocratic one, perhaps both, in a society where religious and political authority were not sharply distinguished. Some scholars, particularly those working in the feminist archaeology traditions, have argued that Minoan society was matriarchal, or at least matrilineal, with women occupying the primary positions of religious and possibly political authority. The prominence of goddess figures in Minoan religion, the centrality of women in the frescoes, the absence of clearly identifiable male rulers in the Minoan archaeological record all support this reading. The absence of identifiable male rulers is in fact striking. In Egyptian art, in Mesopotamian art, in Mycenaean art, the ruler, the king, is prominently depicted in a way that leaves no ambiguity about his power and identity. He appears in battle scenes, in hunting scenes, in scenes of receiving tribute. His name appears in inscriptions, his achievements are recorded. In Minoan art, there is no equivalent figure. There is no person shown in a context that clearly identifies them as a ruler, as the kind of domineering, martial, politically central figure familiar from other Bronze Age civilizations. The closest equivalents, figures shown in positions of authority or prestige in ritual contexts, are as often female as male, and neither gender produces an image that fits the template of the Bronze Age warrior king. This is unusual. It is possibly significant. Whether it means that Minoan society was led by women or ruled by priest-kings who were deliberately not shown in martial contexts, or that political authority was diffuse rather than concentrated in a single individual, or that we simply have not found the right imagery yet, is genuinely uncertain. What we can say is that Minoan society, as reflected in its art, gave women a visibility and an apparent social prominence that was unusual in the ancient world. Whether this reflects actual social reality, actual positions of power and authority held by women, or merely a conventional artistic tradition whose real-world implications we cannot correctly read, is a question that the evidence does not yet allow us to answer definitively. The daily life of ordinary Minoans, the farmers and fishermen and craftsmen who made up the vast majority of the population, is less visible in the archaeological record than the life of the elite. Ordinary people do not get depicted in frescoes. Their tools do not end up in museum cases. Their houses, built of less durable materials than the palace, have left fewer traces. But they are present if you know where to look. The farming settlements scattered across the Cretan landscape, the small villages and isolated farmsteads that formed the economic base of the palace system, have been excavated at numerous sites. They show evidence of the same basic agricultural economy that sustained farming communities across the Mediterranean: grain cultivation, olive growing, viticulture, animal herding, fishing along the coast. The craftsmen who produced the luxury goods of the palace workshops are visible in the industrial quarter of the palace, and in the evidence of craft production at various sites. They were skilled workers. The level of technical mastery required to produce the objects they made implied years of training and a tradition of knowledge transmitted from master to apprentice through direct instruction. The fishermen, and the Aegean was rich in fish, left their weights and their hooks and their bones of fish in the archaeological record. The coastal communities of Crete depended on the sea not just for trade but for food. The farmers who grew the grain and pressed the oil and made the wine that filled the palace storerooms lived in a world that was physically laborious and seasonally demanding, but that was also, in good years, abundantly productive. The Cretan landscape, carefully managed, could support a significant population. The springs and streams that ran down from the mountains provided water for crops and livestock. The forests of the uplands provided timber and fuel. It was a good land. Difficult in places, generous in others, like all lands, and the people who worked it, generation after generation, from the first Neolithic farmers down through the Bronze Age and beyond, shaped it as it shaped them. We have mentioned the writing systems of the Minoans, Cretan hieroglyphic and linear A, and noted that neither has been fully deciphered. This is worth dwelling on, because the silence of the Minoan written record is not merely an academic problem. It is a fundamental condition of how we understand, and how we cannot understand, this civilization. To appreciate the scale of the problem, consider what we can do with Linear B. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greeks, adapted from the Minoan Linear A, was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, an architect with no professional training in classical archaeology or linguistics, who worked on the problem as an amateur enthusiast. His decipherment, achieved through a combination of brilliant cryptanalytic reasoning and genuine scholarly insight, revealed that Linear B was an early form of Greek. Once that breakthrough was made, the world of the Mycenaeans opened up in a way it had not before. We could read the tablets, we could understand the administrative records, we could see names, personal names, place names, names of gods and goddesses that tied the Bronze Age Mycenaean world to the later classical Greek world, showing the threads of continuity between them. Linear B allowed us to hear Mycenaean voices, not the full, rich voices of poetry or history or personal correspondence, because the tablets are administrative documents rather than literary texts, but at least the dry administrative voice of record-keeping, inventory management, and economic accounting. It was something. Linear A is maddeningly close to Linear B. The two scripts share a large number of signs. Perhaps 80% of the Linear A signary was carried over, with modifications, into Linear B. The two scripts were adapted to write related purposes: economic administration, record-keeping. They appear in similar archaeological contexts, but the underlying language is different. And without knowing what language Linear A was recording, the phonetic values established for Linear B cannot be straightforwardly applied to Linear A. When scholars apply Linear B phonetic values to Linear A signs, they get something that sounds vaguely like a language. There are recurring sequences, patterns that might be grammatical endings or word boundaries, but it does not resolve into any known language family. The Minoan language, whatever it was, appears to be a language isolate. It does not seem to be related to the Indo-European language family, which includes Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and most of the languages of Europe. It does not seem to be related to the Semitic languages of the Near East. It does not seem to be related to the Egyptian or the Sumerian or the Hurrian. It was, apparently, something entirely its own. There have been proposed decipherments over the decades. Some scholars have argued for connections with Luwian, an Anatolian language. Some have proposed connections with the pre-Greek language of Cyprus. Some have proposed more exotic connections. None of these proposals has achieved scholarly consensus. None of them has produced the equivalent of Ventris's breakthrough, the moment when the language suddenly becomes legible, when the tablets begin to speak. Linear A remains silent. This silence has profound implications for what we can know about the Minoans. Every ancient civilization that has left readable texts has left us something that goes beyond archaeology, something of how the people thought about themselves, their world, their gods, their history. The Egyptians gave us the Book of the Dead, and the pyramid texts, and love poetry, and medical manuals. The Sumerians gave us the Epic of Gilgamesh, and hymns to Inanna, and lists of kings stretching back before the flood. The Hittites gave us treaties and prayers and myths. Even the Mycenaeans, with their purely administrative Linear B tablets, gave us names and gods and enough to feel that we are in contact with actual people. The Minoans gave us their art. Their art is extraordinary. It is sufficient in its way to make them one of the most vivid civilizations of the ancient world, present to us in their images, in the physical beauty of the objects they made, in the color and line and form that they used to express their vision of the world. But it is not words. And without words, without the language in which they expressed their inner lives, their beliefs, their stories, their sense of who they were, there is something fundamental we cannot reach. The Minoans speak to us constantly, through their art. We cannot quite hear what they are saying, and yet their legacy is everywhere. The Minoans are not merely a fascinating historical civilization, a brilliant Bronze Age culture that rose and fell on a Mediterranean island. They are, in a very real sense, part of the foundation on which Western civilization was built. The most direct transmission was through the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans absorbed the Minoan achievement. They adopted the Minoan administrative system and adapted the Minoan script to write their own language. They built on Minoan architectural traditions. They absorbed Minoan religious concepts. The prominence of the goddess in Minoan religion can be traced forward into the female divine figures of the Mycenaean world, which in turn flows into the Greek Olympian goddesses. Athena, Hera, Aphrodite, Artemis, Demeter, the great goddesses of the classical Greek pantheon carry within them, in transformed form, something of the divine feminine that was so central to the Minoan religious world. The Mycenaean civilization, in turn, was the world of the Trojan War, if the Trojan War was historical, and the world that Homer remembered, centuries later, in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Homer's heroes fight in bronze armor, ride in chariots, give gifts of precious metal, and are served by queens who weave at great looms in palace halls. These details are not invented. They are the preserved memories of a Bronze Age world, a world that had, by Homer's time in the 8th century BC, been gone for 400 years, but that survived in the amber of oral tradition. The Iliad and the Odyssey are the most influential literary works of the Western tradition, the texts from which Greek literature grew, and from which, through Rome and through the European Middle Ages, all of Western literary tradition ultimately derives. They are set in a world that is, in its essential character, the world of Mycenaean Bronze Age Greece, and that world was shaped, fundamentally, by its Minoan heritage. The bull, in particular, travels through the tradition with remarkable persistence. The Minoan sacred bull, the bull of the bull-leaping fresco, the bull whose horns consecrated the palace altars, the bull whose roaring was perhaps heard as the sound of earthquakes, became the bull of Greek mythology. The Minotaur, half man, half bull, dwelling in the labyrinth beneath the palace of Minos on Crete, is a distorted memory of the Minoan world's obsession with this animal. The story of Europa, abducted by Zeus in the form of a white bull and carried to Crete, where she becomes the mother of Minos, may preserve a mythologized memory of the cultural contact between the Eastern Mediterranean and Crete. The labyrinth itself, the building so complex that no one who entered could find the way out without divine assistance, is named, as we have said, perhaps for the Labres, the double axe. And the double axe is a Minoan symbol. The labyrinth is the Minoan palace, seen through the distorting lens of centuries of mythological retelling. Theseus, who navigates the labyrinth with the help of Ariadne's thread, is one of the great Greek heroes. His story may preserve a memory of mainland Greeks, Mycenaeans, entering the world of Minoan Crete and finding their way through its complexity. Ariadne, who gives Theseus the means of survival, is a Cretan princess, a Minoan woman whose divine associations are clear in later tradition. She becomes a goddess, a consort of Dionysus, a figure whose connection to the underworld and to transformation gives her a resonance that goes far beyond the heroic saga. The myths of Crete, the myths that the Greeks told about this island, in their own language, in their own cultural framework, are the shadowy afterlife of the Minoan world in the Greek imagination. They are not reliable history. They are not even, in most cases, reliable mythology in the sense of accurately preserving ancient religious traditions, but they are the persistent echo of something real, of a world that existed, that was powerful and fascinating and deeply strange, and that left an impression on the cultural memory of the Aegean that 3,000 years could not entirely efface. The Minoan artistic tradition also persisted, in transformed form, far beyond the end of the palatial civilization. The naturalistic, fluid, pleasure-taking quality of Minoan art, its delight in the movement of animals, in the grace of the human body, in the beauty of the natural world, did not simply disappear when the palaces were destroyed. It flowed, through the Mycenaean tradition, into the artistic culture of the Greek Dark Ages, and from there into the geometric period and the archaic period. The classical Greek tradition of naturalistic sculpture, the tradition that would produce the Parthenon frieze and the Discobolus and all the other achievements of Greek art that shaped the subsequent Western artistic tradition, was not born from nothing. It was the culmination of a long tradition of careful, pleasured observation of the natural world that had its roots in the Bronze Age Aegean, and specifically in the Minoan delight in showing the world as it actually was. The spiral, that endlessly turning form that runs through Minoan decoration, is also a Celtic motif, and a Greek motif, and a motif that appears in the art of cultures from prehistoric Ireland to Bronze Age China. It is a universal symbol, but the particular, fluid, organic form of the Minoan spiral, the spiral that seems to breathe, that seems to grow, that seems connected to the movement of water and the coiling of shells, is a specific cultural contribution that can be traced forward through the centuries. The dolphin, the octopus, the flying fish, the Minoan marine iconography, flows into Greek ceramic decoration, and from there into the decorative tradition of the ancient Mediterranean world. Every painted Greek amphora with a marine scene carries the shadow of a Minoan fresco painter, who first decided that the creatures of the sea were beautiful enough to deserve careful observation and vivid representation. The palace, as an architectural concept, the idea of a large multifunctional building that serves simultaneously as residence, administrative center, storage facility, and religious space, was developed by the Minoans to a degree of sophistication that influenced the Mycenaean palatial tradition, and from there influenced the palaces of the classical Greek world. And the sea trade, the interconnected Mediterranean economy that the Minoans helped create and that the Mycenaeans inherited, laid the groundwork for the later maritime economy of the classical Greek world. The routes that Minoan ships traveled to Egypt and the Levant and Cyprus were the routes that Greek traders would follow 1,000 years later. The relationships between the Aegean and Egypt, between the Aegean and the Levant, that the Minoans established were the relationships that sustained Greek civilization in the classical period. The Minoans were not remembered. They were not celebrated in the historical tradition of the ancient world. They left no written records of their own achievements, and their civilization had been too thoroughly absorbed into the Mycenaean world and then too thoroughly lost in the Bronze Age collapse to survive as a distinct cultural memory. When the Greeks of the classical period thought of the Bronze Age, they thought of the Mycenaeans, of Agamemnon and Achilles and the heroes of Troy. They did not think of the Minoans. But the Minoans were there, in the foundation, in the myths, in the art, in the ocean routes, in the shape of the palace and the image of the goddess and the sacred bull whose shadow falls across the labyrinth. The island of Crete is still there. This is, in a sense, the most obvious thing that can be said about it. But there is something worth pausing over in this fact, in the continuity of a landscape that has been inhabited and worked and loved for 9,000 years, that has seen the rise and fall of the first European civilization, that has been conquered and reconquered, and has outlasted every power that ever held it. The mountains of Crete are as they were. The Ida Massif rises above the central plain exactly as it did when Bronze Age pilgrims climbed to the Dictaean cave to leave offerings at the sanctuary of what the later Greeks would call Zeus. The northern coast still curves in its gentle arc, the same bays and harbours that sheltered Minoan ships now sheltering tourist ferries and fishing boats. The sea is still that impossible, unreasonable blue. The olive trees of Crete, may be the most eloquent witnesses to the island's long history. Olive trees live for extraordinary spans of time. Some of the trees growing today on the Cretan hillsides are hundreds of years old, and there are records of individual trees of enormous antiquity. The olive orchards of Crete, maintained and harvested through every historical period, represent a continuous thread of agricultural life stretching back through the Byzantine and Roman and Hellenistic and classical periods to the Bronze Age. The Minoans grew olives. They pressed the oil and stored it in their great pithoi and traded it across the Aegean world and used it to anoint bodies and to fuel lamps and to offer to their gods. When you pour olive oil in Crete today, you are participating in a tradition that is 4,000 years old. The Heraclean Archaeological Museum contains the greatest collection of Minoan art and artifacts in the world. If you visit it, and if you ever have the opportunity, you should, you will find yourself in the presence of objects that redefine what the ancient world was capable of. The snake goddess figurines, standing in their glass case with their direct, compelling gaze and their coiling snakes, are smaller than most people expect, but they hold the eye. There is something in them, in the precision of the modeling, in the specific posture of the extended arms, in the quality of attention that the unknown maker brought to these objects, that speaks across 3,500 years with a clarity that more famous ancient objects sometimes do not achieve. The gold ring from the tomb of a Minoan nobleman, showing a scene of ecstatic worship in a sacred grove. Dancing figures, a tree, a divine figure floating in the sky above, is an object of extraordinary density of meaning. Every element is significant. Every gesture speaks, and we can only partially read what it says. The harvester vase, with its procession of men carrying what may be winnowing tools and singing or shouting as they walk. One man's mouth open in what seems to be genuine exuberance, another's face showing fatigue, is the most human object in the museum. These are not idealized divine figures. These are people, caught in the act of being people, working, singing, tired, alive. Outside the museum, on the hillside south of Heraclean, the Palace of Knossos waits. Evans's reconstruction remains controversial among archaeologists. The red concrete columns and the reproduced frescoes are not what the palace actually looked like in its Bronze Age glory. They are Evans's vision of it, a vision informed by genuine scholarship, but also by the aesthetic preferences and the cultural assumptions of an Edwardian Englishman who came to the site with a theory and built a monument to it. But standing in the central court at Knossos, even with all these reservations, is still an experience that repays the making. The scale of the space, the way it opens against the Cretan sky, the way the restored portions of the palace frame the view on three sides, gives you something of the original experience. The smell of wild herbs from the hillside above, the light of the Mediterranean sun, which is unlike the light of anywhere else in Europe, and somewhere beneath your feet, under layers of concrete and interpretation and the accumulated weight of a century of debate, the real palace waits. The palace that was built and used and modified over 1,000 years, the palace where the bull leapers performed, where the scribes sat with their clay tablets, where the olive oil accumulated in the great jars, where the frescoes were painted in a single sitting in the hours before the plaster dried. The palace is still there, waiting for better methods, better questions, better understanding. The rediscovery of the Minoans at the beginning of the 20th century came at a moment when the modern world was hungry for exactly what the Minoans seemed to offer. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of deep cultural anxiety, a period in which the certainties of Victorian civilization were being undermined by the discoveries of science and the disruptions of industrialization, in which the rational, Christian, progress-oriented narrative of European history was being challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. Into this world came the Minoans, or rather, Evans's Minoans, a Bronze Age civilization that seemed to be peaceful rather than warlike, that worshipped goddesses rather than gods, that celebrated the beauty of the natural world in its art rather than the glory of kings and battles, that gave prominence to women in ways that had no parallel in the ancient world most people knew, the world of Greece and Rome and the Old Testament. The Minoans were, in the early 20th century imagination, everything that Western civilization was not. They were the civilization before the fall, before the warrior culture of the Greeks, before the legalism of Rome, before the patriarchal monotheism of Christianity. They were the happy world that had been lost. This reading was, of course, a projection. The actual Minoans, the people who managed the palace economy, who organized the collection of agricultural surplus, who participated in a competitive trade system, that also traded in human beings who probably practiced ritual killing of animals, and possibly of humans, who lived in a hierarchical society with sharp distinctions of status and power, were not the innocent children of nature that early 20th century romanticism wished to find. But the projection said something real about the needs and desires of the modern world. The hunger for a civilization that seemed to have a different relationship with nature, with the divine feminine, with beauty and joy and the pleasure of the physical world. This hunger was and remains genuine. The Minoans became a screen onto which these hungers were projected. They became important to the feminist archaeology movement of the 1970s and 1980s, which saw in the prominence of women in Minoan art and in the goddess religion evidence of a pre-patriarchal civilization, a world before the domination of male warrior culture. Writers like Marija Gimbutas drew on Minoan and other prehistoric evidence to argue for the existence of an ancient matriarchal civilization that had been violently replaced by the patriarchal cultures of the Indo-Europeans. The scholarship behind these claims has been widely criticized. The evidence for a pan-European matriarchal civilization is not in fact strong, but the cultural impulse that drove the argument was real and important. The desire to find in the ancient past a model for a different kind of civilization, one in which feminine values were central rather than marginal, was and remains a powerful motivating force in how people engage with the Minoan world. The Minoans have also become important in the New Age movement, in neo-pagan religious practice, and in various forms of contemporary spirituality that seek to reconnect with the pre-Christian religious traditions of Europe. The goddess figures of Minoan religion, the snake goddess, the mistress of animals, the great female divine presence that seems to have been central to the Minoan world, have become icons of an alternative spiritual tradition, symbols of a religious sensibility that places the divine feminine at the center of its cosmology. Whether this religious appropriation accurately represents what the Minoans actually believed is, to put it gently, uncertain. But it demonstrates the living power of the Minoan legacy, the way in which a civilization that ended 3,000 years ago can still speak to human needs and desires in the present. The Minoans have entered popular culture in the obvious ways: novels, films, games, and stories set in the Bronze Age Aegean world. Some of these are historically informed and careful. Others use the Minoan world as an exotic setting for adventure or romance, with minimal concern for historical accuracy. Either way, they demonstrate the continuing fascination with this civilization, the continuing sense that there is something in the Minoan world that speaks to us across the millennia. And perhaps the most honest thing we can say about why the Minoans speak to us so powerfully is simply this: they seem to have known how to enjoy being alive. The art says it: the dolphins swimming in the Queen's bathroom, the swallows darting through the lily field, the bull leapers soaring, the blue monkeys in the painted garden, the procession of women in their elaborate dress, the octopus embracing the vessel. Whatever else they believed, whatever else they did, however their economy was organized, and their politics conducted, and their wars fought, the people who made this art were people who found the world beautiful, who wanted to capture that beauty and hold it on the walls of their rooms, to surround themselves with it, to live inside it. This is not nothing. This is in fact quite a lot. We need to sit with something larger for a moment. The Minoans occupied their island for over 5,000 years in total, from the first Neolithic farmers who arrived from Anatolia around 7000 BC, to the end of the Minoan Bronze Age civilization around 1200 BC, and beyond that, in the Greek and Roman periods, into the medieval and modern world. The island of Crete has been continuously inhabited for 9,000 years. The people who live there today are the descendants, biological and cultural, of all of those layers of human experience. Within that long span, the Minoan palatial civilization occupied roughly 1,000 years, from the first palaces around 2000 BC to the final collapse around 1200 BC. 1,000 years is an enormous span by any ordinary human measure. It is longer than the Roman Empire lasted in the West. It is longer than Christianity has existed as an organized institution in most of the world. It is longer than the span between the Norman conquest of England and the present day. Within that 1,000 years, the Minoans developed, refined, and expressed one of the most distinctive cultural visions in human history. They built palaces of extraordinary sophistication. They created art of enduring beauty. They organized an economy that was, by the standards of its time, impressively complex and impressively productive. They traded across a significant portion of the known world. They developed writing systems that we have not yet learnt to read, and then they were gone. Their language died. Their writing systems were abandoned. Their palaces were ruined and buried. Their gods were renamed and assimilated into other traditions. The specific, vivid, individual culture they had built over 1,000 years was absorbed into the Mycenaean world, and then, when the Mycenaean world collapsed, into the silence of the Dark Ages. This is the fate of most human civilizations. The ones that survive, that continue to be named and celebrated and studied, are the exceptions. Most of the complex, sophisticated, creative cultures that have existed in human history are known to us only dimly, or not at all. The Minoans are unusual in that they are known. They are known because their art was magnificent enough to survive in the ground, durable enough to endure the millennia, vivid enough to command attention when it was finally excavated. They are known because their palaces, built in stone, left foundations substantial enough for archaeologists to trace their outlines. They are known because a man with a walking stick and a theory arrived on a Cretan hillside in 1900 and would not stop digging until he had found everything. They are known because we wanted to know them. There is something in the Minoan story that speaks to a universal human concern, the concern with what endures and what is lost. Every civilization knows, at some level, that it is temporary. Every culture that produces great art is producing something whose purpose is, among other things, to outlast its makers. The Egyptian pyramids were built to last forever. The Greek temples were built to endure. The Minoan frescoes were painted to last only as long as the plaster on the walls. And yet here they are, the frescoes of Knossos, in fragments, in reconstructions, in the memory of the pigments that were once so vivid on those painted walls. The dolphins still swim, the bull leaper still soars, the lily field still blooms. There is a kind of immortality in this. Not the immortality of the name. The Minoans were forgotten. Their name was Evans's invention. The people who painted these images did not know they would be called Minoans. But the immortality of the image, the immortality of the made thing, the immortality of beauty that is sufficiently true to continue speaking after everything else has fallen silent. The Minoan artist who painted the swallows over the lily field did not know that 3,500 years later, on the other side of the world, people would sit in the dark and hear a story about those swallows and feel something. They could not have known, but they painted the birds with enough care and enough observation and enough love for the actual swallows that dart through actual Mediterranean springs that the image crosses all the distances of time and geography and speaks. This is what art does. This is why art is made. The swallows are still flying. After 35 centuries, the swallows are still flying. We have spoken much about the visual arts of the Minoans, but there is another dimension of their culture that we should dwell on, even if the evidence for it is more fragmentary. The Minoans made music. We know this from their depictions of musical instruments in art, and from the instruments themselves, some of which survive. The lyre, a stringed instrument, appears in Minoan frescoes, a figure on a painted sarcophagus from Hagia Triada. The Hagia Triada sarcophagus, one of the most important ritual objects from Minoan Crete, shows a figure playing a 7-stringed lyre, presumably in the context of a funeral ceremony. Other figures on the same sarcophagus play double pipes, the orlos, the paired reed instruments that would become one of the defining sounds of Greek music. The double pipe appears in multiple Minoan contexts and was clearly a significant musical instrument. Its sound, a bright, penetrating, somewhat wild sound, would have been heard at ceremonies, at gatherings, perhaps at the festivals that marked the turning points of the agricultural year. Percussion instruments, clappers, sistrums, and what may be drums, also appear in Minoan contexts. The sistrum, a rattle instrument associated in Egypt with the goddess Hathor, appears in Minoan ritual contexts, suggesting either direct Egyptian influence or a parallel development of a similar instrument for similar purposes. The singing voice was almost certainly central to Minoan communal and religious life, as it has been in virtually every human culture. The processions depicted in the frescoes, the long lines of figures moving through the palace spaces with their offerings and their ritual objects, were almost certainly accompanied by singing or chanting. The ceremonies in the central court, the celebrations at the peak sanctuaries, the rituals of the agricultural festivals, all of these would have had their musical dimension. What the music sounded like, we cannot know. No Minoan musical notation survives. No Minoan musical instrument is preserved with sufficient completeness to allow its tuning to be reconstructed. The scales, the modes, the rhythms, the specific sonic world of Minoan ceremonial and everyday life, all of this is lost. But the impulse toward music, the desire to organize sound into pattern and meaning, to use the human voice and the instruments it has made in its own image, to mark the important moments of communal life, to celebrate and mourn and worship through the medium of organized sound. This impulse is as universal as any human characteristic. The Minoans had it. They expressed it with the same seriousness and sophistication with which they expressed everything else. The dance also figures in Minoan life, as we can infer from certain images. Dancing figures appear on seal stones and on frescoes, their postures suggesting ritual dance, arms extended, bodies in motion in ways that have a deliberately formal, ceremonial quality. The relationship between music and dance, between the sound and the movement, between the performer and the gathered community that watches and participates, this was as present in the Minoan world as in any other. The communal gathering, the feast, the ceremony, the festival, was the social glue of Minoan life, just as it was the social glue of every pre-modern culture. The palaces were designed to accommodate large gatherings in their central courts. The great ceremonial areas were capable of holding significant numbers of people. The palace administration organized the storage and distribution of food and drink that made these gatherings possible. When the Minoans gathered, for the great religious festivals, for the ceremonies associated with the changing of the seasons, for the bull-leaping performances that combined athletic display with religious meaning, they were doing what all human communities do when they gather. They were reminding themselves of who they were. They were renewing the bonds of shared identity and shared belief that held them together. They were performing, for each other and for the gods, the story of their civilization. This performance, this ongoing, collective, ritually organized act of being a civilization, is what the palaces were for. Not merely storage, not merely administration, not merely display of wealth, but the making and remaking, season by season, year by year, generation by generation, of a shared human world. The Minoans made their world with extraordinary beauty. They poured beauty into it, into the painted walls, into the golden jewellery, into the carved stone vessels, into the ritual performances in the central court. They insisted, with a stubbornness that reads across the millennia as a kind of statement, that the world ought to be beautiful, that the things we make ought to be beautiful. That beauty is not a luxury, but a necessity, as necessary as grain in the storerooms and oil in the pithoi and water in the springs. We have lost much of what they knew. We cannot read their language. We cannot hear their music. We do not know the names of their gods. We do not know what stories they told around the fire, what fears they whispered in the dark, what hopes they carried with them to the peak sanctuaries to leave in clay and bronze and gold. But we have the swallows. We have the dolphins. We have the bull leaper soaring over the bull's back in the central court of Knossos, his body arched against the sky, his hands pushing off from the horns that are as large as the whole world, his flight as brief and as perfect as any flight has ever been. We have their art, and through their art, imperfectly and partially, and with all the misreadings and misinterpretations that inevitably come with the distance of 3.5 millennia, we have them. We began on an island, a long island stretched across the southern arc of the Aegean, with a spine of mountains and a northern coast of sheltered bays. An island in spring, smelling of thyme and wild sage and the sea. An island where something was being built, or rather, where something had already been built, over generations, slowly, by people who could not see the whole shape of what they were making, but who kept making it anyway. The story we have told tonight, the story of the Minoans, is like all the best stories, a story about the relationship between creation and loss. The Minoans created magnificently. They created palaces and frescoes and gold jewelry and carved stone vessels and a trading network that stretched across the Bronze Age world. They created 2 writing systems, one of which is still waiting to be understood. They created a way of seeing the world, joyful, sensuous, rooted in the beauty of the natural world, that was unlike anything produced by their contemporaries, and that speaks, still, to something fundamental in the human experience, and they lost it all. Or rather, it was taken from them, by earthquake and volcano and invasion and the catastrophic unraveling of the Bronze Age world system that brought not just Minoan civilization, but Mycenaean civilization and Hittite civilization and the great cities of the Levantine coast, all down together in the 12th century BC. This loss is real. It was a genuine catastrophe, not just for the people who lived through it and saw their world destroyed, but for the subsequent history of the world. What might Western civilization have become if the thread of Minoan culture had not been broken, if the palace economies had continued to develop, If the linear A script had remained in use, and the Minoan language had survived to be written down and read and transmitted, we cannot know. The question is unanswerable, but the loss is also not total. The Minoans are gone, but they are also present in the myths of Crete and Greece, present in the art of the Mycenaeans and the classical Greeks, and the entire subsequent Western tradition, present in the place names. Some of the place names of Crete may preserve pre-Greek, Minoan words, though this is difficult to establish with certainty. Present in the agricultural traditions of the island, in the olive trees and the grape cultivation and the sheep on the hillsides, present, perhaps most powerfully, in the objects they left behind, in the cases of the Heraclean Museum, in the reconstructed frescoes of Knossos, in every gold ring and seal stone and painted vessel that carries their vision of the world into the present. And present, now, in the fact that we are telling their story. Every civilization that is forgotten is lost in a deeper sense than the merely material. The buildings can be excavated, the objects can be displayed, the frescoes can be conserved, but if no one is paying attention, if no one cares, then the civilization might as well not have existed. The Minoans were forgotten for 3,000 years, and then Evans dug them up, and then the world noticed. And now, 4,000 years after the first palaces were built on the hill at Knossos, people all over the world are learning their name. This is, in a modest way, the kind of resurrection that the Minoan religious tradition may have believed in, the return of the dead, not in the same form but in a transformed form, in a new life that carries the essence of the old. The Minoans are back. Not as they were, not in the palaces, not in the spring ceremonies, not in the bull leaping and the processions and the intricate administration of the palace economy. They are back as a story, as an image, as an inspiration, as a reminder that Europe's first civilization was something magnificent and strange and deeply worth knowing. They were the first. They were here before everything that came after, before the Greeks and the Romans and the Byzantines and the Venetians and all the other powers that have held sway over this sea and these islands, before the idea of Europe had taken shape, before the gods of Olympus had been named, before Homer had imagined his bronze-armored heroes. Before all of that, the Minoans were painting dolphins on the walls of their palace rooms. They were leaping over bulls in the central court. They were sailing to Egypt and coming home with gold and ivory. They were carving their seal stones with miniature masterpieces of naturalistic art. They were pressing their olives and filling their pithoi and keeping their records in a script we cannot read. They were here. And they were extraordinary. Let that be the last thought as you slip towards sleep tonight. Not the drama of their ending, not the mystery of their language, not the debate about their palaces or their politics or their social structure, but the simple, astonishing fact of their existence. In a world that was still, by most measures, primitive, a world of scattered farming communities and small chiefdoms and tribal territories, on an island in the middle of the blue Aegean, a civilization invented itself. It did not receive civilization from somewhere else. It did not copy another model. It looked at its landscape, its mountains and its sea and its forests and its agricultural valleys, and it built something new, something that had never existed before. And then it painted the sea on its walls. The dolphins are still there, swimming through the painted blue of a palace room that is now a ruin, in a palace that is now a reconstruction, on an island that is now a tourist destination with cafes and rental cars and Wi-Fi and all the comfortable apparatus of the modern world. But the dolphins are still there, still swimming, still leaping, still moving through that impossible, unreasonable blue. They always will be. Thank you for listening tonight. Thank you for traveling with us to the Blue Island, to the painted palaces, to the world that stands at the beginning of everything that came after. The Minoans gave us much that we have forgotten we received. They gave us, through the long chain of transmission and transformation and inheritance that connects the Bronze Age Aegean to the present day, something of our way of seeing the world, something of our sense that beauty matters, something of the impulse to make things, to paint walls, to carve stone, to press images into clay, as a way of saying, I was here, this is what I saw, this is what I loved. I was here. If this story has given you something, a glimpse of a world you did not know existed, a feeling for the strangeness and richness of the human past, the simple pleasure of sitting with a story in the dark, share it with someone who might need it tonight. Leave a comment. Tell us where you are, what the night sounds like where you are, what the sky looks like outside your window. We are all, tonight, sitting around the same fire. The embers are low, the sea sounds, somewhere not too far away, in its ancient, patient rhythm. The island is still there. The mountains are still there. The olive trees are still there. And somewhere, in the foundations beneath the reconstructed columns of Knossos, the first palace is still there. The original building, the one that was there before Evans and before the later reconstructions, the one that was built by people whose names we do not know, in a language we cannot read, for reasons that are partly clear and partly hidden from us. It is still there, waiting. Sleep now. Carry the story with you. The dolphins will still be swimming in the morning.